Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Frank Ginn. I'm the senator in the 47th district, but I tell people all over the state, I'm your senator. So it's just those people that live in the 47th district decide how long I keep this gig. For me, I get to chair the Natural Resources and Environment Committee in the Georgia Senate. I want to welcome you to our study committee today. I'm going to turn a few things over to my counter co-chair, Chairman Lynn Smith, who's a lot smarter and better looking than I am. So, Chairman Smith, I'm going to ask you to open up our meeting with prayer and go from there.
Okay, will y'all please bow your heads with me? Our Heavenly Father, we ask your blessing upon us today as we go about service to the citizens of the state of Georgia. We need your help and your guidance as we debate issues that are so important to every part of our state. We ask your blessings upon us and us to your service. Amen. So, first of all, this is a phenomenal center. I've never been here, and a compliments to Athens for what they have accomplished. I want to also welcome our committee members. We are a total of 12 committee members, but we'll take a moment at the end of this and go around and introduce ourselves, where we're from, what our career is, and then we'll turn it over to Frank again and we'll begin our agenda. But this would not happen today without staff, and so I want to start off by asking our staff members who are here. They're going to say, oh no, just stand for a second so we can recognize them. And they have done everything to setting this up, and Brent's not standing up over there, but he's over there. And so I just want to tell Brent and gosh, everybody who's here, because I know we have CBIG, Providence Institute of Government. They found chairs for us. We needed extra chairs, so I thank you for that. Let me mention briefly who the people are who help us. First of all, I want to thank Brian, excuse me, I'm jumping around here. Blake Doss is our policy analyst. Jeremy Airy and Lori Brill are our legislative counsel. And Brett is here. Then Nicole Chappelle has pretty much taken the role of getting the announcements out and doing all like that for us. So I thank her for that. And I think your administrator is back at work now,
She
Betty.
just came back.
She's been out on sick leave, very serious surgery. One of the difficult things when you stop and think for a minute, the people who serve in the General Assembly are what's called citizen legislators. And so that means we have other jobs. We live out and among the citizens we represent, but we're not experts necessarily on anything but the fields in which we've chosen our profession to be in. And so when we assemble, and we're one of the first governments formed in the United States, and it's been that many years, and representative government still works and works well, but it works because of the engagement and the involvement of people who are here today. Our committee members who are willing to serve, the staff at the Capitol who've done such an excellent job, the people in the audience who've made a point to come here today to listen and to participate, and also to all the presenters who are here today. So I want to thank you for that. For me, essentially, when I first ran for office, and it's been a while, I was saying, well, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And I said, you know what? I think I'm going to listen and learn. And then from there, I hope I can lead. That is my mission. It always has been my mission. So I am looking forward to the program we have today, and our chairman again will begin that. But before we do, we'll start to my right. Frank, if you will introduce yourself, and then we'll just go around so the members can know and give you a second to think. So Brent Cranfield is here with our communications and media. Our webmaster is what he is. This meeting is archived. So for the ones who missed the meeting, you can go, I think starting tomorrow, and it'll be uploaded for you to look at. So this is to give just Georgia citizens an idea of their government at work. So go ahead.
My name is Frank Norton Jr. I'm from Gainesville, Georgia. My brother and I own the largest privately owned insurance real estate company in the state of Georgia called the Norton Agency, 19 offices, 300 people. We're primarily we're in the insurance business. I'm primarily here because I'm the largest property manager in Northeast Georgia, broker in Northeast Georgia, and we've been in business 89 years.
My name is Courtney Reich. I have a consulting firm in Savannah, Georgia called Ecological Planning Group. We do natural resources planning for local governments throughout the Southeast, primarily in Georgia. We assist local governments with stormwater projects such as MPDS compliance and establishing stormwater utilities.
My name is Brian Johnson. I'm the city manager of Peachtree Corners, Georgia, the newest and largest city in Gwinnett County.
My name is Taylor Anderson. I own Blue Land Works. We're a civil engineering and land surveying consulting firm, and I've served as chairman of Gwinnett County's Development Advisory Committee for several years now, and as part of their Stormwater Technical Advisory Committee as well.
Yes, good morning. My name is Mike Blanton. I represent the 75th District of the great state of Georgia, out of Clayton County, the city of Jonesboro. And I've been doing this for about 12 years now, so it seems like just yesterday. But I'm excited about the possibilities that will come out of this study committee, and I look forward to hearing from many of you through the course of what we do.
I'm Mike Thomas. I'm the general manager of the Clayton County Water Authority. Been there about 19 years. Been working in the water resources field from the state, regional, and local level for over 30 years.
I'm Steve Leo with Gwinnett County Department of Water Resources. Currently the Director of Permitting and Regulatory Services with the county's Department of Water Resources. I was previously the Stormwater Management Director and managed a bunch of the utility work that went on with the stormwater utility in Gwinnett.
Turn it over to our chairman from the Senate.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. You know, a lot of people look at our group and you see a little diversity here. And one of the things that I'm just going to read a sentence off of the legislation that we passed to get this study committee moving. And it's for the purpose of striking the proper balance between water quality protection and the equitable sharing of burdens for impact of stormwater systems, blah, blah, blah. Said they, now for many of y'all, you may not understand exactly my background and a little bit about me, so I'm going to tell you, first off, I'm an engineer. Said they, I've managed 3 local cities, 3 local governments, 2 cities and 1 county for a total of 20 years. And I'm going to brag on and thank both GMA and ACCG for working with me to bring this information to us and for being our host today, quite honestly, to the, in where we're at. And I think our local governments are where the buck stops. You know, I as a state senator, I get to do a lot of different things, get to learn a lot of stuff, and we're always trying to make it a little bit better. I was an old 4-H'er, said the motto of 4-H is make the best better. When I see a problem, I want to try to address it. I'm an engineer, so I try to fix problems. And I'm going to pick on Mr. Kenneth Sheely, who's in the back. If you would, Mr. Sheely, would you mind standing up and saying hello to the group?
Kenneth Sheely, Walmer, Darton, Oglethorpe County.
Thank you, Mr. Sheely. Mr. Sheely is one of my constituents. I represent about not quite half of Athens. Said over on the east side of Athens, he first came to me, and he's had a farm there since the 50s. Said and he told me, he said, well, Frank, I don't mind paying my taxes, but you know, this stormwater fee, I don't like it. Said I'm not going to pay it. And I said, okay, well, let me find out about it. I looked up on Athens Clark, and is Blaine Williams in the room, the county manager here in Athens. I looked on their website, and they have a program where they give credits for certain things and how these things get addressed. So for me, I said, okay, looks like there's a good credit program. You ought to be able to get credits and probably, you know, let me come out and take a look at your farm. And we rode around his farm. He's got about 100 acres in Athens, Clark County. In that 100 acres, he had about a 10-acre lake. Now, I don't want to get too technical, but it had about 2 feet of freeboard in that lake. That's the difference between normal pool and the point where water comes in and water goes out. Said so he's got some pretty good stormwater detention and some abilities there. So I said, well, Mr. Sheely, it appears that you ought to be able to mitigate that, said with the fees with what you're providing to Athens, Clark County. So I referred him to another friend, an engineer, and they ran the numbers. basically that drainage basin was about 350 acres. Said Mr. Shealy has about 100, has very minimal impervious surface on it. Said so when you look, he owns a small portion of the drainage, and there's a mobile home park, a subdivision, a bunch of roads, other impervious surface that's draining into his lake. So you look at it and said, okay, now his cost, said to benefit for Clark County, let's see what's going on. So when I studied it, said he's actually a huge asset for their stormwater program. And so I met with the county commissioner, local county commissioner there, the county manager, their stormwater folks, which one of them is actually here, and I'm proud that she's left Athens Clark because she's come to work for EPD, and I'm proud to have her skills in that area. But for me, I looked and I said, you know, this property is really an asset to Athens Clark County's stormwater program. He's providing regional detention for several properties around. Turns out, said that wasn't going to happen. So they said, no, he's still going to have to pay these fees. We give credit for these things, but he's got to pay these fees. I started looking around other parts of Athens with other constituents that were complaining to me about stormwater fees. Now, I'm going to tell you, if I live in Athens and I'm a property taxpayer in Athens and I look at the University of Georgia and a lot of tax-exempt properties, I'm not against stormwater fees. Because when you think about stormwater fees, you know, if you're a tax-exempt organization, you're not paying your fair share of keeping the maintenance and the system operating. Now, one of the things, and you're going to hear a lot of history, but one of the things that's happening is the stormwater fees are a utility. Now, I was an engineer. I grew up in electric utility. I worked for Georgia Power. I worked for Jackson EMC. I run a couple of LDCs in the gas distribution business. So I've run a lot of utilities, water and sewer. Name a utility that you don't pay based on quantity, and I'll tell you, that's the interesting part. So for me, you know, sometimes you just try to introduce legislation to get the discussion started. I introduced a one-page bill, very simple bill. And you would have seen a ripple effect across the state. All my friends in local government thought I was the enemy. Said I'm not. Said, but I am going to try to make sure that we're not doing something that's going to hurt business in our state and hurt our state's growth and economic well-being. At the same token, remember, I get to chair the Natural Resources Environment, so I'm going to look after what's going on in our state. For me, I'm very excited to have this committee and get some dialogue today. What we're going to do is we're going to hear from some experts. We're going to hear from people in kind of the history of how this developed. We're going to hear kind of a synopsis of how we got to where we are. And then I'm going to ask to hear from y'all. If you haven't seen it, there's a sign-up sheet if you want to speak. We're going to have a public comment, and I'll stay here till the cows come home. I know that we're going to see some things this afternoon. Our committee's going to make a tour of some facilities here in Athens. Athens Clark County has some great opportunities to see, and I want to welcome you to go along on that tour if you'd like. So, with that, Chairman said I'm going to let you call on our first presenter.
So, one thing, always housekeeping, we will always find more chairs. We're always texting to Blake if we need some more chairs. So it's great to see the turnout here. So if you notice we need chairs, somebody let me know and we'll attend to that. And I wanted to mention also briefly that our legislative counsel, Jeremy Airy, in the back is moving to North Carolina, so we're going to miss him a lot. But he's the one who crafts the legislation when we finally come up with the idea, and Lori will be replacing him. So our first presenter, and we have everything set up here, and remember this is archived, is Glenn Barron. Glenn.
With EPD.
With EPD. Whoops, I better really know your name.
Well, good morning. Good morning, committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name is Glenn Barron. I'm the manager of the Non-Point Source Program at EPD, and was asked to give a brief overview of stormwater and what the requirements are. So requirements start with the Clean Water Act. It's a federal law established in 1972 to regulate point sources of pollution. So these are sources like wastewater treatment plants that discharge to our waters. They've regulated industrial wastewater and municipal sewage, and originally stormwater wasn't included. But when you look at stormwater, you see that there is impacts from stormwater, and it all starts with the watershed. So we have a little diagram of a watershed here. So you have rain falls, and then it runs off and makes its way into our rivers. As that runoff happens, it can carry pollution with it. So this pollution is why Congress chose to regulate stormwater, to address that pollution and ensure that the purposes of the Clean Water Act, which is to restore the integrity of our nation's waters, is maintained. There was an extensive study done in the 80s, and EPA established that stormwater was a leading cause of water quality problems and wasn't being addressed at that time. Urban runoff was noted as being a major contributor to water quality degradation. So there's a diagram here that shows various stages of development that can happen. We start with a natural system, a forest. So when rain falls on a forest, 80 to 90% of that rainfall is absorbed into the ground and then makes its way through the groundwater back into our rivers and streams. And about 10 to 20% of that water runs off from that forest directly into the rivers and streams. When we increase density and increase that impervious surface, those hard spaces, those roofs, those pavements, that causes runoff to increase. So the runoff can carry pollutants with it, and there's additional runoff. So when you get to a residential type scenario, you're looking at 40 to 50% of that runoff, and then only 50 to 60% is then absorbed into the ground. Now when you get to an urban area, like the one we're in now, in downtown Athens, you see a lot of impervious surface, a lot of roofs, a lot of pavement, not as much trees. And because of that, you have lots of runoff. You have 90 to 100% of that water runs straight into the river, and it can carry pollutants. So that's why Congress then chose to regulate stormwater. They regulated it through an amendment to the Clean Water Act. It was first passed in 1987 to address stormwater. It addressed both industrial stormwater, so stormwater that comes from our industries, and municipal stormwater, which they called MS4, or Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System. In 1990, EPA took that law and published rules, and then it established a gradation of communities with different grades of requirements based on their population. So large communities with populations greater than 250,000, those were regulated first. There was medium population between 100 and 125,000. Those were then regulated. And then in 1999, EPA chose to publish they called it the Phase 2 rule, which regulated small communities. Now there's a specific process that a community becomes regulated as a small community. It's generally urban areas with populations less than 100,000. So these urban areas are designated by the U.S. Census. So this can mean that a portion of your community might be regulated as an MS4 and a portion might not, depending upon where those census lines fall. So it's ultimately a census decision as to whether your community will become regulated as a regulated MS4 or not. So based on those regulations and that Clean Water Act law, EPD is delegated to issue EPDES permits. These are National Pollution Discharge Elimination System authorized by that Clean Water Act permits. We have permitted 45 Phase 1 large communities, 12 Phase 1 medium communities, and 107 Phase 1 small municipalities. And that also includes separate permits for the Department of Transportation who has runoff from their roads, and for our Department of Defense bases as well. At EPD, we do both the permitting, so we write this permit here, and we also, within EPD, do the compliance for that. So we will regulate and make sure that our communities are abiding by that permit. The permit requires communities to do some things to address stormwater runoff and stormwater pollution. This includes public education, things like presentations to school groups, clubs. That's an example of some of the public education and ways communities can meet that. It's also public involvement, so that means taking the public's ideas, getting the public involved in protecting water quality. And an example of that can be a volunteer water quality monitoring program, like an Adopt a Stream program that EPD also works with. The MS4 permit also requires something called illicit discharge detection and elimination. So what this means is looking for illegal connections, so people who've connected something to that storm system that doesn't belong in the storm sewer, be it a sewer line or some other discharge line, or people who are dumping things into the storm sewer that don't belong in the storm sewer, like oils or paints, things like that. So the community has to develop a map of their system so they know where to look. They have to inventory all their outfalls, know where they are, and then inspect them at least once every 5 years to see if there's any evidence. And it's hard to see that picture a little bit, but you see there's a little staining and discoloration coming out of that storm pipe, and that's not supposed to be there. And then they would have to track that back, respond to complaints, and make sure that that is addressed. So that kind of illegal connection or illegal discharge. The MS4 permit itself also requires a construction stormwater management program. This overlaps with our separate construction permit. If there's communities a local issuing authority, they would essentially run their stormwater program, which means they have site plans they have to review, they have to inspect their construction sites for development. They track and respond to complaints and ensure that their inspectors are adequately certified. Not everyone is a local issuing authority designated by PD. Some of them may have PD doing that, and that's allowed in the permit as well. Post-construction stormwater management is that runoff we talked about, that extra runoff that comes from impervious surface that can carry pollutants. The permit requires municipalities to manage that, to manage new and redevelopment projects. And there's a threshold for that. They have to disturb at least an acre or create new impervious surface over 5,000 square feet in the permit. And what they have to do is either retain 1 inch of that runoff on site, and retaining means installing practices that will infiltrate, like this bioretention area. So the stormwater runs off this parking lot, enters this depression, and then soaks into the ground, where it can either infiltrate into the lower groundwater table or there may be an overflow after it's treated through those plants that help remove that pollution. If they can't do infiltration because they don't have enough room, their soil is poor, or contaminated, or some other reason, there's also an option to treat that 1.2 inches or 80% reduction, which can be things like a pond or an underground detention area, or some people will install vaults, so you may see large pipes being installed under the ground for storage purposes. That's another way you can do it. The permit also requires you to protect stream channels, so that stormwater discharge, when you have a pipe, you can have lots of volume of water. You want to protect that channel so that it's not washing out, so that it can carry the stormwater adequately. And you want to make sure that you're protecting downstream areas from flooding as well. Because when you increase that impervious surface, there can be more runoff, which can increase your flood elevations. So the MS4, the municipality, has to map and inventory those structures, inspect them, and make sure that they're maintained. There are also some housekeeping requirements, various things that a municipality has to do to keep pollution out of our stormwater. These are things like making sure the pipes are properly inspected. Here's a picture of a pipe inspection here. Making sure that there's not holes, that those pipes are adequate, and then that there's a process, procedures for maintaining those pipes that carry our stormwater. They have to do a street cleaning program, parking lot cleaning program, making sure that they're kept clean, such as street sweeping, litter cleanups. And they want to inspect municipal facilities, things like maintenance yards where they're doing auto repairs, things like that, where there might be pollution getting into stormwater. And they also have to train their employees to make sure that people who have stormwater requirements know how to do their job. They're required to have an enforcement response plan, which is, if you find a problem, what are you going to do about it? And an impaired waters plan, which is, if you discharge into a water that's not meeting water quality standards, you have to sample that water and determine practices that you can do to try to restore that water. Again, as part of that goal of the Clean Water Act, to restore our waters. If you're a phase one, which is one of the large communities, you have to look at your industries, make sure that there's an inventory of those industries that might discharge to your system. Look at something called high visibility pollutant sources, which are essentially things that aren't regulated industries but still may cause pollution, and maintenance yards, or perhaps auto repair shops are a good example. They're not industries, they're not regulated as industries, but still they could cause pollution. So communities can choose which of those they wish to regulate, they think make sense in their community, and then inspect them. Fiscally, the permit does have some requirements for reporting, essentially. So the permit doesn't say that a utility has to pass a utility fee, doesn't tell you how you have to fund the program. But you do have to report your expenditures, if you're a large community, and a plan for how you're going to pay for it coming forward, and then demonstrate that you have funding to do all those things we just talked about. Demonstrate that you can run your program. In phase two, you don't have those fiscal reporting requirements. It's thought to be too burdensome for the smaller communities, but you still have to implement your program, so you still have to have funds to do that. So just to wrap up, municipalities are required to reduce pollution to that maximum extent practicable, which is a Clean Water Act term, through the implementation of their stormwater management program. They have to do a variety of things, including public education involvement, the illicit discharge, looking for dumping and cross connections, construction management, post-construction management, and then good housekeeping controls. I don't know if we have time for questions or if we wanted to save them.
We do, and what we'll do is, to our audience, there's a sign-up sheet outside, and at the end of these presentations, there'll be a chance to comment. To our committee members, if you have a question, just state your name, because we're archiving this meeting, and then ask your question. So, any questions? Yes?
Frank Norton, when did it go from stormwater management to the practice of becoming a taxing utility? And was there actually state legislation that enacted the local groups to be able to do that? And under what authority do communities have the right to tax for this utility service versus using it out of their general funds?
Yeah, there may be somebody who's better able to answer that than me.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think that Glenn and EPD, because it's not in state law, it is one of those things, and we will have some speakers that can address that question a little bit later, said that are kind of the history of how we got to where we are. And actually, I think Dr. Keller, who was one of our afternoon presenters, said they was the first local government in the state to do that. So he'll give you a little bit of address on that.
I do have a question.
Yes,
All
sir.
right, go
Mike
ahead.
Thomas, you mentioned programs are required to infiltrate the first inch. Is that a relatively new requirement? Has that been in the permit? The permit program's been around for quite a while, right?
Yeah, so that's a new requirement. It's not in all of our permits yet, you're correct, but it's coming to all our permits. It is in the phase one medium permit now. It's in the GDOT permit, and it will be coming. It's in the draft of the phase two permit that's out now. So for purposes of an overview, that would be the requirement. Phase one is not today required to do that. We expect it to be rolled in the near future.
So the program kind of continues to mature, new requirements. As you guys learn more, you place new requirements on local governments.
Yes, and I think that's part of the the way of implementing what is the Clean Water Act term of maximum extent practicable. As practices improve, as practices change, then if there's an expectation from EPA, which regulates us, that those practices will continue to evolve and improve as technologies improve and evolve.
Representative Glenn.
Representative Mike Glanton, my question is kind of a follow-up to Mr. Thomas's question. With the additional requirements for implementation, there's going to be increased costs. Have we looked at the costs to the local municipalities in regards to implementing these new, regardless of what phases?
Yes, that's certainly true. There is a cost to doing all of these things. That is not part of EPD's analysis. We don't do a cost analysis specifically. We do consider practicality through that language to make sure that it is possible and that communities or other communities are doing these sorts of things. But we don't do any formal economic analysis. EPA has done some economic analysis in terms of whether these practices are affordable and can be maintained. And so we do use that as background. That was kind of a long answer. I apologize for that. Yeah.
Having said that, is there a timeline, not necessarily when we're going to get it down to the municipalities, but the timeline that the municipalities will have to actually completely implement this new phase?
Yes, there is a timeline. Our permit establishes, as these new things are implemented, a compliance schedule. It's 3 years in the current permit for the phase 1 medium that is in effect with these new runoff reduction parliaments.
Glenn, thank you so much, but just a brief summary here for our committee, because we're all absorbing this as we go along. You would be available later to our committee members for questions. Yes?
Frank Norton, is there, again, I'm going to approach it from private development, private owner, not municipality. Is there, this is an EPA national standard, applied evenly across all states, or are there allowances for the different geography across the country within this EPA law?
There are. The EPA, and I apologize for continuing to refer to this term, but it is maximum extent practicable, which, by using the term practicable, allows for different changes. There's some areas out west where there's it's very difficult to see it in actually doing any kind of stormwater practices because it's very hard ground that doesn't infiltrate, for example. And there's allowances in the EPA law for establishing that. It's just one example.
So we as a state have adopted the national standards, or is there an opt-out process for all or pieces of the EPA? And I'm sure the federal government has some sort of carrot and stick. If we opt out, then we don't get some sort of funds. How does all of that?
Yeah.
Maybe
So,
that's too much detail. I'm just trying to understand.
We all
You're
are.
right on line.
Yes.
so
Hey.
EPA has delegated the state. That's voluntary for the state to receive this delegation and implement our own permit. If we chose not to do that, we could give it back to EPA, and then they would write a permit for us. The permit itself is required. What's in the permit is required through EPA regulations and the law itself, and that regulation then gets implemented and translated into the permit. There's some latitude about what that looks like, which I think you would agree, but having the permit and doing it is a requirement.
It is obviously a burdensome on the state of Georgia, and then trickles down to the various governments within the state of Georgia to be able to do this. Are we following the challenges on a federal level from other communities to certain aspects that they may be opting out of this? Are we just accepting are we accepting as an estate anything that the government gives us, or are there ways that we see that Alabama is challenging this in one that might help us economically and help us administratively, help us relief to these cities that such and such, that Austin's doing something different that maybe we could adopt as well? Maybe that's not you.
And we quite honestly look at what's going on in other regions, other states. Said I will tell you, for me, you know, they told me as an engineer, don't reinvent the wheel. So that meant if you've already designed a wheel, I need to look at what you're doing, figure out how it works. Said when we look at this program and its implementation, said I don't have all of the 50 states and kind of what's going on with it, but that's one of the things that we're always trying to monitor, you know, and we have some great folks with EPD and staff that help us with that. So we do want to try to make sure that we're not the poster child for more government bureaucracy if we can help it.
Yes, state your name.
Courtney Wright.
So the process, y'all, so we're so used to it as legislators, look to your chairs and then we'll address to Mr. Barrett, okay?
So, Courtney Wright, Ms. Friend, I just wanted to be clear though, if Georgia opted out of this, then EPA would come down from the federal government and regulate it here in Georgia. Is that correct?
Yes, the regulation of MS4s is a federal requirement of the Clean Water Act. If Georgia chose not to regulate MS4s, then EPA would do it.
All right, you first. Go ahead, state your name.
Taylor Anderson. Is EPD tracking the success of the current or the new infiltration requirements? Is there any sort of data set that we can determine if infiltration is working, for example, on the coastal areas versus more in the Piedmont or in the mountain sections of Georgia? Is EPD tracking the successes of that new legislation?
We have been looking at that, yes. In fact, in the coastal areas, the coastal stormwater supplement, which was, close to 10 years ago now, was implemented, has been requiring such infiltration practices to be considered for some time. We've seen practices in the ground that have been successful and have worked. We actually have a contract with the Department of Community Affairs right now to look into that very question, to kind of do a lessons learned. What have we learned in our 10-ish years on the coast since that has been implemented, and what can we learn going forward?
Sir?
Yeah, Steve Leo. Maybe we'll follow up to Mr. Norton's question a little bit there, but a couple of years ago there was a national stormwater rule where they tried to pull together a national standard for a lot of these things. That's correct, right?
There was a proposed rule that EPA put forward and then withdrew.
Right. And that would have truly provided some more national type standards that were more specific towards stormwater as well.
That's correct.
Yeah. And I also understand that there are different states, but then as I used to be president of SESWA a couple of years ago, we have a policy committee within that organization, and it looks like several of the different states are doing things somewhat differently and are on different timelines. So I think it's fair to say, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that Georgia is possibly on a different schedule and taking a different approach to maybe what other states are doing.
I think it's fair to say that Georgia is taking a different approach to regulating MS4s than other states. That's part of the flexibility we have within interpreting that regulation and applying it as appears appropriate for our state and in our natural conditions.
So, Lynn, one question for me, Lynn Smith, Chair of Natural Resources on the House side. At some point, we trigger a process called Review of Rules and Regs by the Department of Natural Resources Board. Is there a trigger in your applying the federal law at the state level? Like we go to the next phase, is there a review of rules and regs, or how does that work?
Yes, so we do have state rules that empower us to implement these permits. They haven't changed in a while, so they've been in place for some time.
Okay.
There may be someone else in the audience who knows more about that.
We're going to be looking at everything here today. So we're making stormwater soup is what we're doing. So trying to figure out everything. And so our questions are excellent. Really appreciate that. And I think you earned the keep. You've got a lot that you have to do, and we appreciate your answers, Glenn.
Thank you.
Glenn Barron. So thank you, and you are available.
I am certain of that.
Okay, thank you. And before our next speaker comes up, so thank you, we need to have our mics checked. So we have a little logistical situation here, but our next speaker is Scott McClellan. So everything you said to this point, remember? So we can repeat it later.
You guys should have in your folder this
Testing.
PowerPoint
This was
presentation.
presentation.
Testing. Testing. Yes.
Okay. All right. Is there a way to get the mic a little bit closer to the speaker with the podium? Is that?
Thank you very much. Is that better? Good.
Yes, great, thank you.
Scott McClellan, I'm from CDM Smith, and I'm representing the Southeast Stormwater Association. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. I'm going to talk about stormwater utilities in general, mostly from the perspective of what's happening around the United States. I've had the pleasure of working on about 70 utilities in the United States, including the smallest one with 34 homes, and the largest one in the city of Houston. Again, I'm going to talk from a larger perspective of how things tend to be done throughout the United States. Mr. Bauman's going to talk about how this is applied in the state of Georgia, so we kind of, at least I hope, we're complementary. So the first thing is I want to talk about stormwater in general terms, and then I'll talk about the general tenets of stormwater utilities. And I'm using a number of references. If you want to look these up, they're very robust in the information that they provide. One is the Western Kentucky University provides every year a survey of stormwater utilities around the country. They currently have a database of about 1,600 stormwater utilities. They believe that there's approximately 2,000 to 2,500 utilities in the United States. There is a stormwater survey that's done by the Southeast Stormwater Association as well as the Florida Stormwater Association. Together they combine to form about 300 respondents. It is much more robust than the Western Kentucky data set. And then there are two documents that may help describe stormwater utilities better. One is the Water Environment Federation user fee funded stormwater programs, which I had the pleasure of being a co-author, and then the Florida Stormwater Association establishing a stormwater utility in Florida. I also was a co-author on that particular one. Just very general terms, that's the way I understand things, so I really kind of want to present it that way, is that, and this corresponds to the previous speaker, is that when a natural stream, when a rainstorm event happens, across the bottom is time, across the side is the stream flow rate, that as the rainfall event happens, you have some base flow that's kind of basically there all the time. There's a peak and it comes back down to the base flow. That's without urbanization. Once we have urbanization, once we create impervious area, the rainfall itself is quite, and the stormwater runoff is quite natural, but we have affected it by the impervious area. That's a basic tenet of why we're here in the first place. And there are a couple of things that happen as a result of urbanization. Number one, you reduce the base flow. There's not as much water going down, so the water in the stream is less to start with. Second, it creates a big peak, a much bigger peak, and it creates extra volume. The peak also shows up earlier. And with that peak and extra volume, it carries pollutants. One point I want to make about MS4 permitting is that it's related to water quality. It's not related to flooding. And the common joke that we've talked about for a number of years is the fact that EPA doesn't care whether your house floods. They just want the water flowing through it to be clean. Okay. Now that's serious exaggeration, but the point is made. So we have met the enemy, and it's us, based on the Walt Kelly Pogo cartoon many years ago. We're the ones who are creating the problems that we're having to fix. It's not rain, it's not nature, it's we've created it ourselves. So, classically, stormwater utilities originally, well, I'll talk about that in a minute, but classically, stormwater utilities were formed because of drainage issues, because of flooding. And the majority of the utilities in the United States, in my experience, are formed because of quantity, not quality. It's only been in the recent couple of years where, and you'll see it in just a minute, when I show you the dates that they've been formed, it's only been recently that you've seen an uptick in stormwater utility formation to help water quality as well. But don't take away the issue about flooding. Flooding is still the foundational reason why people do stormwater utilities, and the reason being, it is very tangible. It's something you see. You see crews in the road. You see a new facility. Water quality, on the other hand, you don't see so much. It takes a long time to get better. And so it's much easier to, if I can use the term of art, sell a stormwater utility when you're going to get tangible benefits like flood improvements. That's why most of them have gone that way. Okay, so a common way to generate the money in order to fix the problems that you have in your community is a stormwater utility. It is a stable and predictable solution. One of the interesting things we found is for the first time when people get a stormwater utility fee, they can plan for more than 1 year. If the revenue that they use for their stormwater program is based on the general fund, usually you get 1 year's worth of planning because you have no commitment for what's happening after that first year. With a stormwater utility where you have a stable income, so to speak, you can plan for 5 years, you can plan for 10 or even more. So it does facilitate the planning and construction on a triage, on the maximum cost benefit approach. First utility in the United States was in Bellevue, Washington in 1973. Interestingly enough, it was for salmon, to improve the quality of water for salmon. So the first one was water quality, but most of the other ones after that point were water quantity related. There are some 2,000 to 2,500 in the United States and approximately 55 in Georgia. 90%, over 90% of them are based on impervious area, and I'll explain why that works in a minute. Here is a list of the utilities in the United States. The highest number is Minnesota, believe it or not. Second is Florida, and you can see Georgia down here with 55. The average rate is $5.14 per ERU. ERU is another term for a building unit. So normally that represents a single family home. So that's one way to say it. It's $5 for each single family home per month. You can see a couple of things. This is the date that the utilities were formed. You can see the first round that kind of got big was right here in 1993, and that's when the first MS4 permit showed up. But all the ones before it, and many of the ones after it, were related to quantity. You can see an uptick also in 2005, and that's when the Phase 2 permits were issued to a large degree. They used the MS4 permit to justify the fee, but the majority of the money was being spent on quantity-related projects because they're tangible. All right, the logic is, and this is held up in court in Georgia as well as in many other states, and that's this: the management of runoff benefits owners and tenants. Benefit relates to the property's contribution to the problem, and many people call this a stormwater burden. They create a burden on the city and county, and therefore that requires a service to be provided by the city and county based on their runoff. So the fee or assessment relates to runoff, and a common proxy, in fact a very easy one to understand, is impervious area. That's the logic that most people use. It is held up in court in many states in the country. But there are trade-offs here. One of the issues that we constantly deal with is the issue of equity. We want it to be equitable. You have a better chance of providing equity with a stormwater utility fee than you do an ad valorem tax, for example. The runoff has nothing to do with the value of property. A mall, which may have the exact same taxable value as a high-rise building, the mall is going to generate more runoff than the high-rise building. So that's one difference between the two that's very important about equity. If you want perfect equity, you would have a stormwater runoff study done for every property. Then you know exactly how much runoff is coming off your site that the city has to deal with. But that's really impractical. The perfectly simple one is that everybody gets the same fee. It's very simple to administrate, but it's not equitable. So the bottom line is it's a balance of equity and simplicity that almost every utility, not just stormwater utilities, but water and wastewater work with as well. It's not perfect equity. All right, so how fees are calculated around the United States? Generally, this is the case. There are some differences, but generally this is the way it works. And that is you divide the customers into two groups, a residential group and a non-residential group. Residential group is generally built on the number of dwelling units that you have on your property. You look at the average impervious area for single family or all the residential units together. You call that a one billing unit, and then you assign that to each dwelling unit in your community. Approximately 70% of the utilities in the United States do it that way. For non-residential customers, here's just an example where the actual impervious area on a property of this non-residential customer, building and parking lot, is approximately the same size as 3 residential units. So this property pays 3 times the amount as an average single-family unit. That's very common throughout the United States. The majority, about 70% of the utilities in the United States do it this way. Again, not all. So, adding on top of that to increase the equity, there are exemptions and credits. So I'm going to start with exemptions and then I'll go to credits. The first one, this is based upon the Florida Stormwater Association and the Southeast Stormwater Association Stormwater Utility Survey. 61% of the utilities that responded say that they exempt public roads. Interestingly, that is not 100%. Because the public roads kind of represent part of the stormwater system itself. Where does your runoff go? Well, it goes to the road. So I'm a little interested in that particular one. That makes me nervous when it's not 100%. But you can see the other ones are here. Agriculture is considered, public parks, government properties. About 18% of the utilities that are reported exempt government properties, even though they do generate runoff that the city has to deal with. And then airports are a big deal as well. Let me keep going. Let me talk about mitigation credits, which is something that we've been talking about, and that was part of your introduction, Senator. The reason is why you give somebody a credit is that they reduce the burden on the stormwater burden or the services that have to be provided by the city or the community that's administering. And a number of reasons why include that they're not connected to the system, or they have stormwater facilities, or they provide private maintenance of a public system, which does happen in places, or you might want to incentivize them to do good stormwater work. And so you give them a credit to encourage them to do the right things on their property and other pieces of property. And then we're starting to see very recently some incentives to try to improve water quality, to increase the treatment of the quality that's coming off the site. The fundamental requirement here is that the credit should be commensurate with the runoff burden that has been reduced. That's the key to it. If it's not consistent, then you're basically giving somebody a benefit for no reduction in service. You still are going to give them the same amount of service. Amazingly, only about half of the utilities responding to the survey in the Southeast United States have credits. I believe that makes half of the utilities that responded vulnerable. I believe that it's necessary to have a credit in order to be legally, not safe, but more comfortable. It's legally important to do that. The maximum credit allowed is 100%. Only 10% of the respondents have 100% credit. The average credit is about 27% of the fee. We recently did a study of the major utilities in the United States, including Philadelphia. You may want to look at the stormwater utility program for Philadelphia. It's a very robust program. They do not have 100% credit. Their maximum credit is about 70%. Okay, now let me look at two things, and then one is detention. We've been talking about detention, and we've been talking about retention. First, mitigation credits are given for detention facilities around the United States, and here's our old picture again, where because of our impervious area, we've increased the amount of runoff that's coming off a site. The key word is detention, and that basically is that it detains the water, it doesn't reduce it. It detains it. And in so many words, what it does is it takes this water and pushes downstream. It controls the peak rate, but it does not control the volume. The volume of water still goes downstream. Now what you find, we've been doing this in Florida since the mid-1980s, when we had a statewide requirement that you had to put a pond on your property. And what we found is that initially it worked, but now all of this is, oops, I'm sorry, go backwards. All of this water down here is showing up downstream at the same time. And so you still have a problem because everybody has the same requirement to push the volume downstream. And it doesn't work at all in volume sensitive basins. Those are the ones that are what might be called a, the name went right out of my head, I'm sorry. Anyway, where the volume is, it's like a bathtub, where the only thing that'll get the water out is a sinkhole. You can't get out a closed basin, that's what I was trying to think of. And I don't know if you have them here, you probably do in places. But in a closed basin, you control runoff by volume control. And so a detention facility doesn't work. Retention, on the other hand, retains the water. Here's this extra water that we see. They retain the water for the design storm event and below. That's good. However, if you go above the design storm event, you still have a drainage problem. So it's while each of these are better and they improve the flood control and they both provide water quality improvements, they don't solve the problem. And that's the point I wanted to make with these particular slides. So there is increased demand on stormwater programs around the United States. We're finding that most cities have facilities that are at their design life or beyond. We're working with a facility now where 50% of their facilities are greater than 75 years old. They're way past their design life. 40 to 50 years is probably the maximum. User fee must be proportional to the benefit. And this has been proven in many, many places, including the Georgia Supreme Court. There must be a balance of equity and fairness and simplicity in order to result in a fee that's reasonably fair. Mitigation credits should be consistent with the reduced burden. And finally, both detention and retention have benefits, some more than others, but they don't solve the problem for you. So, hang in there, never give up.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
McClellan. To the, of course, I'm Frank, but one of the things for me, being Frank, I just got to ask questions. And when I looked with my partners with GMA and ACCG, our local government representatives, what we saw across the state universally, and this is just in Georgia, but almost to a T, 100% of the 60 or so stormwater utilities that we have in the state, if you don't have any impervious surface, they don't charge a fee. And I kind of look at that and I said, okay, being an engineer, that's a baseline operation. So the point of the legislation that I introduced was so that if you can mimic your property to be basically stormwater neutral. I'm a big proponent for local control. I didn't want to control if a local community wants to put in grip chambers, stormwater recharge requirements, water oil separators, groundwater recharge. They can do all of those things based on the legislation that I have. But I go back to on one of the slides that you presented, and the fundamental requirement was the credit should be commensurate with the reduced burden on the system. And I agree 100%, and pretty much universally here in Georgia, we decided if you don't have any impervious surface, you shouldn't be paying a fee. To me, the biggest credit that somebody gets here in Georgia is 60%. Now, I'm not really good at math, but a 60% credit means you're paying a 40% fee. And that's why this committee is looking at this, because it bothered me and my constituents, and I have several local governments in my Senate district as well as across the state that are doing this. Said what happens with those local governments that don't have any, no fee for no impervious surface? Tell me a little bit more what's going on in those areas, because to me, that's what we inherited from God, and quite honestly, we're trying to get it back to before man had the input on it.
Well, the logic is this, that if you have no development on a piece of property, or you mimic no development on a property, then you create no burden on the community to provide services to deal with runoff from that property, excess runoff from that property. You're still going to get runoff from that property, but it's natural. And so most communities have said that have this exemption, that if you're undeveloped, then you don't create extra services required of us, and therefore you don't have to pay the fee.
And thank you for that answer.
Yes.
Are there other questions, Mr. Leo?
Yeah, Steve Leo, just a follow-up to that. With most of the utilities that you look at throughout the country, when they're looking at certainly the amount of impervious surface on private property, and you build it on, you're paying for the impacts of the water running off from that impervious surface on there. But there's still roads and other public areas that are impervious too. Do you see that most of the utilities, that the funding that they bring in is to cover for the impacts from the roads as well as what's going on with private property?
Most utilities I've encountered do not consider the runoff from the road itself, because most communities use the road itself as part of the stormwater system. So it's basically paying for your system is paying for the system. The logic is not there. Secondly, I've also heard arguments about the fact that there is a robust funding of road systems as it is. Normally, they're already paid for by another program. I do know communities that use the stormwater fees to build, the road is built by gas taxes or whatever it is, but the stormwater system of the road, like inlet structures or swales or whatever it is paid for by the utility fee.
So any culverts that were running under the road,
Exactly,
pipes
that's
under the
right.
roads, they are paid for by stormwater utility fees frequently.
It happens that way. It's not all utilities, but many of them do.
Mr. Johnson?
Brian Johnson, in any of the cities across the country that have a utility, has anybody ever quantified or attempted to quantify the cost on the local issuing authority that doesn't have anything specific to that parcel? Meaning like the regulatory compliance, which has to apply to the entire municipality, or any other public infrastructure that's shared by the entire citizenry or stakeholders within there. So, all the regulatory compliance stuff that we heard earlier at EPD, as well as maybe the fact that public roads are not underwater if it was raining and people are using it to get to their property. So has anyone quantified that part so that you could, they essentially believe that, look, if everyone drank every drop of rainwater that hit their property, so there's still X cost on the city. Have you seen that?
Yes, we do that pretty much every time we do a stormwater utility. There are basically three components of stormwater programs in general terms. One is the administration and what you just described is the regulation, the inspection, all that MS4 compliance. That's one component. The second component is maintenance. Maintenance is general of your existing facilities. That generally is the largest percentage of the total stormwater budget. The third is capital improvements. My experience is that the first component tends to be about 10 to 15% of a total budget. and then it's evenly split with the other two. Okay? That's very general in nature. Some communities are different because of that they either solve their capital improvement requirements, and so it's more maintenance related. But the 10 to 15%, sometimes 20, but mostly 10 to 15% is this management component of the stormwater program.
You follow, Mr. Johnson?
I just one thought, appreciate it. So does that mean that when you add those three components together, that's where you're generally seeing these cities saying, hey, our maximum credit is only, say, 60% because we feel like the remaining 40 is to capture the remaining 30 or the remaining whatever. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say.
Thank you.
Mr. Ryan?
Actually, I think my question might be similar, but I was going to ask specifically to Philadelphia because you mentioned that they have a 70% maximum credit.
Yes.
But a robust program, have they described why they only give a 70% credit?
For the same reason, exactly the same reason, that the services that the customer is getting, even if they have a stormwater system, they give credits for trees over impervious area because that reduces the volume of water that comes through the tree. A very complicated program. They also have a whole team that's assigned to credits. Most cities have a half a person, but they have like 7. Anyway, that's the reason, is that the maintenance, yeah, you can kind of get that taken care of with stormwater facilities and other types of things. And capital improvements that are totally reduced potentially with what facilities you have on your property. But that last management component is related to where the 70, 80, whatever, I can't remember the exact number, but that's approximately where they come from. There are management things that you get, services, and that's because of the limited, even the limited burden that you get because of you exist within the city itself.
Mr. Norton?
Frank Norton. One interesting this is fascinating and at the same time mind-blowing. You've cited studies for the 2,000 across the country.
Uh-huh.
We have unique geography, we have coastal, we have plains, we have a variety of other topography in the state of Georgia. Has there ever been any study of just the stormwater, 60 stormwater systems in the state of Georgia for revenue and how it is being spent? And perhaps that matrix should be done, if it hasn't been, by whatever organization, for best practices for the state of Georgia. I see 2 conundrums in this. One, cities require a private developer to pave, to create impervious area, and then tax them for it. And then handcuff them for that other requirement. That is a conundrum in development standards. Second conundrum is that I'm starting to view this as an opportunity tax. We've created the ability to have this tax, and they seem, at least the cities that I'm aware of, seem to be shifting their stormwater responsibility that might be in their general funds to the opportunity to tax people for that same service. I'm not quite sure how to put all that, how we get our arms around this growing gorilla.
And that's our task. One of the things that we're trying to get today is kind of a history lesson, how do we get to where we are. So of course, I'm looking for input from our committee members on where we want to go. Maybe at a future meeting, we have reports from local governments that are, collecting a fee and kind of how their appropriation for that and what they're doing. I do know that firsthand, we have several groups that are represented here that have stormwater fees, and that is one of the things that we're seeing is those fees are sometimes we're pulling people that may have been paid for out of public works in the road department, and now their work is more tied to stormwater. So we do see that migration, and when you talk about a tax, It's a fee, Frank said. One of the things that
I'm paying it, it's a tax.
I understand, said but as my local government friends will tell you, said a fee, and here's the kicker, a fee can be charged to a tax exempt organization. So that's a key part to remember, and that's where, depending on the circumstances of your local government, it can be more equitable or less equitable.
We have a question.
Got one right here. So.
Okay.
Taylor Anderson, you had mentioned the very visible portions of the stormwater fee, which is tied from impervious area to the runoff and the quantity of that runoff.
Mm-hmm.
Now, another side of that coin, though, that we're seeing more now that you mentioned was water quality.
Yes.
And so, is there any utilities that are making a distinguishing change between? It's easy to say a developed piece of property has impervious area, but a developed piece of property may not have impervious area. For example, a park or a farm is a developed piece of property that has runoff that would be different than what it would be under the God-given or natural characteristics of a piece of property. How are utilities coping with the runoff and the water quality requirements that, say, a piece of property that doesn't necessarily have impervious area, but still has an impact on the stormwater system?
I see two questions in that, and let me respond at first by saying that we are starting to see some utilities that are being developed a little bit more related to quality as opposed to quantity. Those tend to occur when you have a specific pollutant that you have to remove, like Chesapeake, where you have nutrients. They set their fees to some degree based upon the magnitude of pollutants that you discharge, depending on the type of property that you have. But those are very new. In second part, there are very, very few stormwater utilities in the United States that I'm aware of that charge for undeveloped properties. Well, that don't have a lot of impervious area on them. What you find is that, well, I'll tell you, one that I can think of is in South Florida, where they platted the entire system, put the infrastructure in, and then sold all the plats to people up north. So the owner lives in Cincinnati. Sorry, I don't know, that's just an example. But the property's in Cape Coral or somewhere down south in Florida. They charge for that property, even though there's no house on it, because they have an infrastructure that they have to pay for. It's very rare in Florida. There's probably 2 communities in Florida. Of the 190 in Florida, there are 2 that do it that way. And the reason why it's hard to do is because of this, I think. All of a sudden you're charging a lot for cemeteries. All of a sudden you're charging a lot for a park. It goes on, that there's always an example of, holy smokes, we really don't want to do that. So most people have judged that just isn't the right way to go, and so they don't charge undeveloped properties or ones that don't have a lot of buildings on it or things like that.
Following up on that, one of the key reasons that many of our streams here in Georgia are on the non-compliance of the 303D list have to do with fecal coliform.
Yes.
That's a runoff from properties.
Mm-hmm.
If we're charged with cleaning up our water, how do we go about, if we're focused on quantity versus quality, how do we ever get these streams off that list? I mean, you may not be the right person to ask that question. I'm just, a more general question is if our runoff pollutants that we're trying to solve here, it may not be so much quantity based, but quality based now in Georgia to get in compliance with the Clean Water Act. How do we go about solving that problem if we're not looking at quality runoff from property?
Well, I think we are looking at the quality of runoff from the MS4 program, so that there are still programs in place to try to improve coliform and nutrients and other types of pollutants, metals that come off of properties. And generally, communities that have stormwater utilities use the stormwater utility fund to pay for the MS4 program, which includes looking at coliform and how to address those types of things. So while impervious area is not a perfect way to do that, it at least is related to the the quality of water that's coming off the property. It's not perfect, but heretofore people have used that as a reasonable surrogate for that program.
Mike Thomas. Scott, you have a lot of experience in this area, and the foundation to the rule, as Mr. Barron said, was maximum extent principle. And I think most local governments are trying to apply stormwater rules in that same fashion. In your experience, from what you've seen in development, how many developed properties are able to mimic that undeveloped state? So even though they put in the detention ponds and the infiltration, are they totally mimicking and having no impact on the hydrology?
I can say we're getting better at it. It's very hard to do. If you were going to give 100% credit, or the largest credit, most of the folks that do that give it to a 100-year retention pond, one that controls the 100-year storm. That's very hard to do because you need a lot of property and you need the right kind of soils. If you don't have that, it's very hard to reduce. But we're starting to get better through green infrastructure and other types of things like that to mimic natural ways of controlling pollutants. And I'm very encouraged by that. And as we get better at it, I hope that there is a better system of crediting that program. But we just have to get a little bit better at it, I think.
I'm going to address the concern, we talk about fecal and the things there. If you can teach the bear to potty train the bear, we don't have to worry about it. It's quite as bad, so there's my attempt at humor. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
And I appreciate your presentation.
And Doug Bowman is next. Thank you. And if you haven't signed up yet and wish to address the committee, please do so. The sheet's outside. When it comes time for lunch, the lunch is provided for the study committee and staff presenters. We will set a time to return once we know what time we adjourn here to begin our afternoon presentation.
In case you didn't know where the plumbing was, it's just to the left, so now outside the doors.
Okay, good morning.
Morning.
And just to clarify for the record and continue Senator Ginn's attempt at humor, my last name is Boffman. GH sounds like an F. My grandmother was Irish and she married a German. And she said GH was F. Nobody was going to argue with my grandmother.
Okay, so we're going to say it all at one time, Boffman.
Boffman, you got it.
Okay.
Like Hoffman would be.
Okay.
So we're going to focus a little bit more on Georgia here. Scott and I did collaborate. First of all, let me give you a little background. I'm a water resources practice lead for CH2M. And I've been with CH for nearly 30 years, and most of that time doing stormwater and watershed management work here in Georgia. So I haven't been around quite as long as Mike Thomas, but real close. Okay.
Takes care of the airport.
All right, so we're going to burrow in a little bit on Georgia. And I'm going to focus primarily on some of the trends in utility implementation because things have changed pretty rapidly since 2003 when things started, or 99 when Dr. Keller set up Griffin. But we're going to focus on things like rate structure, billing approaches, and especially credits, because clearly credits is the issue here. And then we'll close up, as Scott did, with just a few comments on lessons learned. So as Scott mentioned, there's a lot of stormwater utilities around the country now, and over 55. This is again from that the data from the Western Kentucky study. But going back to Mr. Norton's comment, they really started picking up in Georgia after the 2004 Columbia County case. And this is a case where the Supreme Court of Georgia made it clear that you could bill for stormwater as a fee, and it was not considered a tax in Georgia. So that's when things really started picking up. Until then, there was basically the city of Griffin and Columbia County. And so over the last 15, 16 years, we're up to almost 60, as you pointed out earlier today. And it's become a very important part of the way that our municipalities implement their improvements in stormwater management. But to talk specifically about Georgia, the things that Scott mentioned in general, I think are reflected here in Georgia. But if you look at the three key things, Glenn started talking about stormwater quality. But if these are in what I think are the order of priority for folks here in Georgia. Number one is aging infrastructure. And you're going to hear from some of my colleagues here this morning about the costs of their capital improvement programs. But clearly, aging infrastructure is the driver for most communities in putting stormwater utilities together. The costs associated with the repair and replacement of deteriorated infrastructure is exorbitant. You're going to hear some numbers today. But that ties directly into the flooding issue which Scott talked about. Okay? Maintenance of our storm drains has just not happened. We haven't had the capacity to do that from a funding perspective. And then improving that stormwater capacity as the amount of impervious surface has changed and stormwater intensity has changed, it's just not been able to be done. And then I'd say, although there's more focus on it now, I think if you look at the total cost of what we need to do right now, water quality may be the lowest tier, although we need to increase that for sure. But improvements in water quality and MS4 requirements are very, very important for us. But here in Georgia, aging infrastructure and flooding, and then water quality. So let's burrow in a little bit on rate structures. Scott talked about it. The primary way that people bill right now in Georgia for stormwater utilities is a uniform rate, flat rate, or the ERU type approach. But based on the 2014 study by Black and Beach, nationally, the ERU is used about 67% of the time. Tiered rates, and we'll talk about that in just a second, about 28% of the time. And then individually calculated, which you talked about can be very expensive, is only about 6% of the time. So, going back to the ERU for a second, this is an example, I think this is the point. And this is an example of how you calculate an equivalent residential unit. And this is basically the number of homes times the amount of impervious surface. And basically you take an average of the amount of impervious surface for this sampled set of properties, and then you come up with an average and you bill everybody has a residential property with one ERU. The problem with that is those folks out here that have the most impervious surface are the ones that really get a bit of a deal here. So what folks have done is they've taken, most recently, we're starting to see more folks do what's called a tiered approach. Okay, and so you have a tiered billing system based on the amount of impervious. In this case, it's just an example for 3 tiers. Okay, so each one of these defines a specific rate for an individual residential unit, and then commercial properties pay some percentage of that. Some communities, like our friends from Gwinnett County, because of some improvements in available information on GIS, have actually gone to providing billing people based on the actual imperviousness for every property. And certainly that's the fairest way you can go about that. So how do people bill stormwater utility fees? And this is another thing that came up in the legislature, I think, last session, is whether or not you bill on a stormwater utility bill or as some other utility bill or a tax bill. Again, this is a combination of information from the National, Regional, and the Georgia study. And what you see here is that most of the billing is actually done on the utility bill, and that makes sense. And we'll talk about why in just a second. But a number of folks here in Georgia, it's almost equal here between utility bills and tax bills, and we'll talk about why that's the case. And then there's a small percentage that actually bill on a separate bill. So why is it that we have these two systems? And there's a couple of reasons for this. And especially in Georgia, I think it's important to point out that initially when a lot of this activity built up in the 2000s, the available information for digital tax parcels and impervious area were not very good. So when people looked at the potential for putting the fees on a utility bill, the positive parts of it are that it clearly begins to establish stormwater as a utility, just like the water and the sewer utility. You're paying for a fee for a service, right? It keeps the billing and the revenues within the utility so that you're not having to pay fees to the county tax commissioner or somebody else to collect your money. And plus there's a positive cash flow associated with it. You're essentially getting money on a monthly basis to help cover your needs. The negative parts of doing it on a utility bill is that it can be a very complex database. There are a number of utilities in Georgia that are having trouble with just their basic stormwater, their basic water and sewer utility billing mechanisms, and so you add stormwater on that, it can get pretty complicated. And there's a cost of administration associated with that. And in a number of cases, there may be stormwater utility only bills, because within a community, there may be folks that don't have water and sewer accounts, and so you gotta figure out a way to bill them. And there's an increased administrative cost associated with that. And then initially, there's also a potential difference between the collection rate for a utility, a basic utility, and a billing it on the tax bill. Usually it's higher on the tax bill. So tying it to the tax bill, it's easier to put it on the property owners because that data and information is readily available. Higher collection rate, ease of putting the database together. And if you look at why in Georgia we have a higher percentage, that was the primary issue. So how do you get that bill to folks in a reasonable fashion and have a very low administrative cost associated with that, so that more of that money could actually be spent on fixing stormwater than on administrative fees. The problem with it, of course, is it can be viewed as a tax, right? But it also requires some coordination with the tax assessor, and typically the tax assessor is going to want their cut, right? They're going to want to have a fee to do that. So there's been a shift over time. The tax bill approach was the least costly initially to develop and implement, and the rates were high. Integrating water and sewer billing sometimes has been a challenge. Customer information systems are getting better, but some of them are pretty antiquated, and new ones are very expensive to put in place. The old tax parcel information in a lot of communities is antiquated. It hadn't been updated. And so when you try to overlay tax parcel information on imperviousness, things didn't match up very well. So it was very difficult. And a lot of times we didn't have good locational information on customer information systems to link the tax parcel database with the customer information system. However, recently stormwater utilities have begun to shift more to the utility billing approach because those improvements in digital information, GIS and tax parcel information. I put this graphic out here because this is just one example flow chart that was developed to try to figure out how we were going to take the tax parcel information and the customer information in the billing system and bill for stormwater utilities. So it can be very complicated and costly for the utility to implement. Therefore, in Georgia, initially, the focus was on using the tax bill. So let's talk briefly about credits, or a little more detail about credits. Scott kind of gave you the background on this, but overall nationally, over 50% of the stormwater utilities offer some sort of credit, all right? 53% of those only for residential, about the same amount now offer for both residential and non-residential properties. 76% cap the credits, okay? Talked about that earlier. Here in Georgia, 85% of the stormwater utilities offer some sort of credit. Okay, this is from the UNC study. And the way people offer credits in Georgia has morphed as well. Initially, the focus was on some real simple approaches, tying it directly to the way that you could implement best management practices on your property and reduce the amount of runoff and therefore contribution to the system. And early on, a lot of it was tied directly to the Georgia Stormwater Management Manual. There's 4 simple primary criteria for quantity and quality and stream channel protection. And so the easiest thing to do is to say, okay, well, we're going to max out at 40%. We'll give 10% credit, and it's fairly clear in the design manual what you had to do from an engineering perspective. And so it was real easy for utilities to be able to say, okay, you meet that credit requirement or not. Now, recently, things have begun to change, and there's a lot more opportunities out there for credits. Things associated with watershed stewardship credits, green infrastructure, education, water quality credits, and others. And if you look at what's going on here, people are trying to offer more and more opportunities for credits to do a couple things. One, give some people an opportunity to actually reduce their bill, but also to help get people to understand what their potential implications are for runoff from their property. So it's an educational component as well. There was a study that was done by the Water Environment Foundation about stormwater utility implementation, where they got into, and I'll be happy to share this with the committee members, a much more detailed evaluation of programs across the country, including credit programs, and it's really interesting. Don't have time to get into all of it here today because, frankly, they're all over the place. But one of the earliest examples was in Portland, Oregon, and it started back in 1997. Frank Teller's program, remember, was the late 90s, so this was 20 years beforehand. the interesting thing here is that from a rate perspective, that they have both an on-site and an off-site rate, which, Mr. Johnson, it gets at this issue of we've got infrastructure that we have to deal with that's off-site, as well as what your contribution is from on-site. So this rate structure does actually recognize the cost for managing stormwater on and off-site. So happy to provide more information on that if you want to provide that. Get a little closer to home here, some innovative approaches to credits. Gwinnett County, Steve Leo, I'm going to call you up here, and you can answer some questions that I might not be able to if it comes up here. But two things that I think are interesting that tie directly to Senator Ginn's interests here. One is there's a conservation use valuation approach, and basically agricultural timberland or environmentally sensitive land that meets the conservation use assessment criteria under state code can get a maximum of 10%. Okay. In addition to that, they also offer a low impact parcel credit. But again, this is for parcels that have less than 7% imperviousness on their property, and it maxes out at 30%. So the other question is, do we offer 100% credit in Georgia? The answer is that there are utilities that offer 100% credit for stormwater. DeKalb County is a good example locally here. But as Scott pointed out, typically you have to demonstrate that you're not having any impact, any runoff from your property at all. And normally it's tied to a particular storm event. Okay, in this case in DeKalb County, as you pointed out, Scott, it's a 100-year storm event, and that's very difficult to do, and it's expensive to provide those kind of facilities on your property. So the answer is yes, in Georgia we do that, but there's usually some pretty specific stipulations on how you can meet that. Now, some other options for incentivizing people to reduce stormwater runoff from their property. There's this concept of rebates and grants. Again, the goal here is to encourage people to install best management practices on their property. It may include things like traditional best management practices, some of the vendor-based practices, Senator again that you mentioned. And the idea is to help accelerate the program for specific reasons. The examples of the programs that I've got here on the left, most of these had specific requirements and a consent decree to rapidly reduce the volume of stormwater, typically in a combined sewer type system. And they also, in some cases, have offered grants. Okay, now these grants, a lot of times it's just for low-income homeowners that this is going to be a serious imposition for, but others of these communities have offered grants just to help accelerate the program because they had a stormwater reduction volume requirement as part of the consent decree. So there's opportunities there as well to help facilitate getting additional credits for homeowners. So getting close to the end here, the one thing I also wanted to point out here is that every year the Black and Veatch folks do a survey to just ask the utilities that are in place, do the fees that they generate meet all of their needs? And I think this is really interesting for the community, for the committee to understand. Only 6% of the utilities nationally feel that their existing fees, their rates, cover all of their needs. So there's still a gap in meeting our needs, primarily for infrastructure repair and replacement and addressing flood control. So that's important for, I think, the folks to understand. So just to wrap up here, lessons learned for Georgia, similar to what Scott said earlier, there's a clear need for a stable revenue source for dealing with stormwater management. Most of that related to infrastructure repair and replacement. There are a number of communities in Georgia now that are already using stormwater utility fees to address their existing needs for infrastructure, flooding, and water quality improvement. Almost all of them, or at least 50% of them, require some credits for best management practices. And 100% credits are allowed, but typically they don't. And nationally, it's, as Scott pointed out earlier, it's less than 10% of stormwater utilities allow 100% credit. So with that, I'll try to address any questions.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? Whoops, our chair, sorry.
Yeah. Doug, if you would, let everybody know the difference between a 25-year rainfall event and a 100-year rainfall event.
Okay. Got a simple way to put it is a 100-year event.
Oh, put the math on it for me.
Okay.
The amount of rain in a 24-hour.
Well, it varies by geography. A 100-year event is a 1 in a 100-year event occurrence. It's a 1% probability of an event occurring. Unfortunately, we've had a lot of those events, and it's very difficult for people to understand statistically because you think, oh, it's only going to happen once in a 100 years. But here in Georgia and the Southeast, especially this year, we've had multiple 100-year events across the board. A 25-year event is the probability of that happening in every 25 years. So it's a 1 in.
I'm wanting you to quantify a
Volume
25-year
wise?
rainfall event and a 100-year rainfall event for our committee members.
Okay, for North Georgia,
Yeah.
you're talking about volume?
Yeah.
I actually, if
Inches.
it's okay, this morning I looked at the 25-year event within our Georgia Stormwater Management Manual just for, we took the centroid for Gwinnett, and it's just under 6 inches.
Okay.
In rainfall.
In a 24-hour
Okay,
period.
sorry.
Yes.
That's a 25-year.
It's 0.234 inches per hour, or something like that.
And a 100-year event,
I didn't look at 100,
Does
sorry.
anybody in the room remember?
I believe 100 years close to 7 inches.
So it's a little
Okay,
less
so
than
you-
10, yeah.
so-
13 or 11.
what I wanted people to understand is there's very little difference in the quantity of a 25-year event and a 100-year event. Said I want you to think about that as we look at this. Now, you mentioned DeKalb County, and I know we have somebody here from DeKalb County. Is DeKalb County the only stormwater utility fee that you know of that does 100% credit, or are there others that provide 100% credit?
In Georgia, I think there are others. I don't know. I didn't quantify that because I didn't get into all 55 of them.
And I'd love to know if anybody in the room knows of others that do 100% credit.
Yeah, ours is similar to Cavs. If you can prove that the runoff leaves your site, you
No runoff leaves your site is your requirement. Now, that's interesting because I know for a fact that in Clayton County, said you don't charge if you don't have any impervious surface on the property.
yeah.
Said and there's a big difference because I want everybody to understand when we're talking about this, if you have no impervious surface on your property, and I don't care whether we're talking about a pasture or some pine trees or a cotton field or whatever it is, but you don't have any impervious surface on your property, there's not a fee charged in Clayton County. But what you're saying, in order to get 100% credit, no stormwater leaves your property. Big difference.
Yes.
Very, very, very big difference. And that's where, as our committee works in future meetings, I want people to understand, because the emphasis for me is where we're at with a anti-development fee, or tax, as some people like to say. But quite honestly, that was one of the things that I want to point out here. The legislation that I introduced before we started in this committee process was stormwater neutral. Basically, you mimic the unimproved, no impervious surface, you're not paying a fee. So, thank you.
Good clarification.
Any other questions? Yes.
You cite Blackett Bitch, I think, several times in the entire study of 2014. And I guess they did a national study.
Right. It's
But
a
they-
survey that they've done 4 or 5 times now. It's a
Okay, but
national
they only
survey.
had 78 recipients out of 2,000. Is that bothers me statistically, that such a small sample? That was on your 4th page?
Let's back up. Keep the audience.
Down there.
Back.
Back there. Black and Bitch, 2014, 78 respondents out of 2,000. I worry that that's a very small statistical percentage. Is that the same study you've used throughout the other sightings here?
I've used several of the references that Scott mentioned, but there's basically 3 primary surveys that I used: the Black and Beach survey, there's the SESWA survey, and then there was a UNC study that was done specifically on Georgia.
Second question, sorry, this is Frank Ward. Second question, if it's on the tax bill, if the tax fee is on the tax bill, can you lien a property for stormwater fee?
My friend Brett Harrell will tell you,
No.
we're working against that.
Yeah.
Most
Try to
don't.
do that.
We don't want somebody to lose their property because a
Yeah.
utility fee is not paid. So it's a
Simply
good,
going
it's a good
direct.
discussion. We're having that discussion right now at the Capitol.
And Mr. Norton, I think that if you look at it, most of them treat stormwater utility fees like they treat other fees on a tax bill, like a sanitation fee or a lighting fee or other things. And typically those are not lienable. Is that
Yeah,
a term,
correct.
lienable?
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong,
State your name and then your next, okay.
Courtney Wright, I had a question, but I was gonna address that first. I believe that stormwater fees are considered non-lienable fees.
Yeah.
The solid waste fees on tax bills are the only currently lienable fees.
Oh,
in
thank you for the
Georgia.
clarification.
Direct lienable, you can file a FIFA and have an indirect lien for unpaid utility fees.
Okay.
So, my question was, we're talking about these facilities, whether they treat the 25-year, the 100-year storm, correct, these fees are all connected to the overall drainage system that the community manages, is that correct? They are
Correct.
connected hydrologically to those
Typically,
systems?
yes.
And I believe your first slide had something about that was the highest cost to that, and maybe it was the previous presentation, but that the highest cost to the local government is addressing those drainage systems to which these BMPs are connected.
Yes.
Okay. And then, and you had mentioned that the 100-year storm has happened several times. How frequently does a 25-year storm typically happen?
Well,
I know statistically.
historically or recently?
Recently, I guess
Four times as many as a 100-year storm.
Right.
Yeah, they're both happening much more frequently than we've experienced in the
So,
past.
like multiple times a year, the
It can.
25-year storm?
It can.
Mr. Leah?
It was just.
We hope not.
Yeah, sorry, Steve Lee, I was just going to follow up on Courtney's statement. There are two different types of liens. There's direct liens and there's indirect liens. And the tax liens are the direct liens. You don't have to go before court for judicial review over that sort of a lien. The indirect liens, you do have to go for a court. And we have not, but would utilize those indirect liens where we have to go for a court before we would actually lien the property to collect installment fees.
Good clarification. Thanks, Steve.
So, before you leave the podium, we
Yes,
want to
ma'am.
thank you, Mr. Boffman, and Scott McClellan, and Glenn Barron for your presentations. It's been very informative. There's an awful lot to take in, and as our chairman was saying, we will, as a group, get input when our meeting is over this afternoon to figure out where our next direction will be. We have time now for public comments. I have 6 people who have signed up, and if you could, Mark, you're the first person, Mark Wisely.
Very good.
And so if we'll limit our time to around 4 minutes each, not to exceed 4 minutes, we give each person time to have some say. So thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mayor. Yes, again, I'm Mark Wisely. I'm Director of Laboratory Environment and Compliance with the Macon Water Authority. And we thank Senator again, Senator Jeffers, Representative Smith, Representative Glanton, for the opportunity to provide these comments to the Joint Study Committee on Stormwater Management Fees. The Macon Water Authority provides water and wastewater services in Macon County, and we also serve the city of Byron, Jones County, and Monroe County. We know the importance of maintaining and improving public infrastructure for the health, safety, welfare, and economic well-being of our citizens and businesses and industries. This is just not our water mains, sewer lines, and treatment facilities, which we have responsibility for, but the stormwater infrastructure that is a vital part of our community. All of this infrastructure requires adequate funding to build, operate, maintain, repair, and replace. We are pleased that the Trump administration has recognized the value and importance of infrastructure and that adequate funding is needed. An example is the Water Infrastructure Financial Leadership, which was just published by the US EPA under the leadership of Scott Pruitt. A matter of fact, Clayton County Water Authority was recognized as a real-world example of financial leadership in this. In 2012, Jacobs Engineering published a report that the authority, the Macon Water Authority, the City of Macon, and Bibb County funded. The study found that extensive infrastructure issues and deficiencies in the cities and county stormwater programs and approximately $10 million a year would be needed to begin to bring them to an acceptable standard by the year 2017. The study recommended a stormwater utility managed by the authority and funded by utility services based on impermeable surface. The study stated, one of the key reasons counties and cities throughout the United States have adopted the stormwater quality approach is that service fees offer the most stable source of support and best prospect of sufficient revenue for all sorts of program costs. The service fee revenue stream is very stable over time, even with allowances for credits and offsets that recognize the mitigative measures some customers are able to install to reduce their stormwater impacts and costs. Further work on developing a stormwater utility was put on hold while Macon Bibb consolidated in 2014. In 2015, the authority asked our local legislative delegation to amend our charter to enable us to provide stormwater utility services. This was needed for the authority to actually provide stormwater services and be a stormwater utility. The authority would have to contract by mutual agreement with another government. This is the same process that allowed the authority to come into existence and provide water and sewer utility services. HB 623 was then passed and enacted. It states, as authorized by and pursuant to an intergovernmental agreement with the governing authority responsible for stormwater control in the area served by the authority, to provide stormwater management services and operate, maintain, develop, and repair and construct a stormwater management system and utility in the area served by the authority, to issue bonds therefore, set rates, establish fees, and enter into agreements regarding the same, and to perform any and all actions related to the operation and maintenance of such stormwater management system and utility, including the right to exercise all powers that are now or may hereafter be invested in the authority in connection with operation and provision of water sewer services in the area which it services. Later in 2015, we began a multi-year study with Bard, Wagner, Sutherland, and Cannon to assess infrastructure and service needs and determine the best path forward to ensure that the community has adequate stormwater services and infrastructure. This was done with Macon-Bibb County supporting the idea. MWA has met numerous times with Mayor Rickard, commissioners, and their upper management over the past 2 years. Again, it has been found that a stormwater utility using service fees based on impermeable surface is the best route to begin the numerous issues that exist and improve the system for future generations. We're now beginning negotiations to finalize an agreement with Macon-Bibb County. If legislation such as SB 116 or anything similar is enacted into law, it would severely interfere with local governments and disrupt the funding needed for stormwater utilities services, which are vital for the health and welfare of citizens and allow communities and businesses to grow and prosper. The disruption of funding will not only be in daily operating expenses, but also in the degradation of the credit rating for revenue bonds, which are dependent upon cash flow and liquidity and used to finance capital needs. If MWA, if we were the storm utility at such time, would no longer be able to be that utility because of the lack of adequate funding. And thank you for allowing me to comment.
Thank you. Cassidy Lord is next, and then after Cassidy is Brian Kill. If you'll give us your name and who you represent. Thank you.
My name is Cassidy Lord. I am the Vice President for the Upper Oconee Watershed Network. We are a local volunteer-based grassroots 501c3 nonprofit here in Athens, Clarke County. We have gathered water quality data for the past 20 years in ACC watersheds. Thank you all, Senator Ginn, committee members, for taking the time to hold this meeting and to hear our public comments. The Stormwater Ordinance of Athens-Clarke County was established to protect, maintain, and enhance the public health, safety, environment, and general welfare by establishing minimum requirements and procedures to control the adverse effects of stormwater runoff and non-point source pollution. Stormwater runoff is the #1 cause of degradation to ACC streams. Runoff transports animal waste, petroleum products, and chemical pesticides into our streams. Additionally, stormwater runoff carries silt and sediment into streams, choking oxygen from riparian organisms and exacerbating flood conditions. Stormwater retention and reduction is the #1 way that municipalities can improve water quality while simultaneously reducing catastrophic flooding. The increasingly urbanized and impervious nature of our towns and cities reduces the effectiveness of natural riparian buffers. Traditionally, these vegetative strips of undeveloped land greatly reduce sediment and pollutant load transported into our creeks. In order to compensate for their loss, stormwater systems must be developed and maintained to treat and reduce stormwater runoff. Stormwater fees adjudicated by the Georgia Supreme Court as being an appropriate levy upon property owners allows municipalities to provide the services and infrastructure necessary to mitigate the negative effects of stormwater. A fee is more equitable than a tax by ensuring that all beneficiaries of stormwater mitigation pay for their services. Athens-Clarke County also has a fair process for reducing fees based upon the runoff characteristics of a specific property. Additionally, ACC staff has recently recommended the Mayor Commission undertake a review of fee rates to include additional adjustments and incentives for implementing best management practices. UON opposes state legislative efforts to ban or reduce stormwater fees because A, it will cause stormwater management systems to be underfunded. B, a 25-year, 24-hour storm event water neutral system is ambiguous and insufficient. And C, such actions violate the fundamental rights of home rule. The American Society of Civil Engineers gives stormwater systems, Georgia stormwater systems, a grade of D+ or poor. Due to its inadequate sewer infrastructure, Atlanta was required to pay over $2.5 million in fines for dumping raw sewage into the Chattahoochee River. State Bill 116 will reduce a municipal government's ability to maintain an adequate stormwater system. In the long run, this will cause more catastrophic flooding and degradation to our water resources, including drinking water and recreation opportunities. State Bill 116 is setting up a failure in our aging stormwater systems that the next generation will have to rectify. We are already witnessing the results of inadequate investment in infrastructure. Businesses are rejecting relocating to Atlanta because of underinvestment in transportation infrastructure. Businesses will see these and other infrastructure shortcomings as an eventual expense for which they will be reliable for through increased property and corporate income taxes. State Bill 116 will be bad for Georgia businesses. The 2016 edition of the Georgia Stormwater Management Manual does not contain the term water neutral site. The definition of such a term would require expertise in geomorphology and hydrology of all sites in Georgia. As this commission is well aware, the geomorphology of Georgia is highly varied from rocky Piedmonts to alluvial plains. Identifying a scientifically based definition of water neutral is an enormous task, one for which the EPD is not currently staffed. Furthermore, in the last 5 years, as we've discussed, we have witnessed multiple 100-year storm events. Scientific consensus is that the frequency of such events will increase in the future, and a limited 25-year horizon is foolishly inadequate. In editorial comments, the Honorable Senator Ginn stated that he believes in the ability of a community to decide the right choice for its citizens. As indicated above, stormwater management must be tailored to the geomorphology and hydrology of the area in which it is implemented. Wresting control of the design and implementation of the stormwater management system from the municipality, the state will be forcing a one-size-fits-all requirement on Georgia communities, leaving some at an even greater risk for flooding and degradation of the water supply. Such actions also preclude the possibility of the local citizenry to implement a system that is more rigorous and protective than the minimum required by the state, thereby usurping the right to a higher quality of life. And I'd just like to make a note that we, all of us in this room, consume water that come out of these waterways every single day. UON joins the Georgia Water Coalition, the Georgia Municipal Association, and the Association of County Commissioners of Georgia in opposing State Bill 116 and other similar measures to exempt individuals and their properties from common sense management of our natural resources. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Laura. Brian Keel is next, and after Brian is James Moore. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Brian Keel. I'm the Deputy Director of the Douglasville-Douglas County Water and Sewer Authority.
Sorry, we can't let us talk. Why don't you hold up the stand?
It's fine.
You can fix that.
I'd like to thank the committee for the time for us to provide input this morning. I kind of wish I had signed up to speak before the last two speakers because I don't have any such eloquently drafted talking points. I really just wanted to spend a few minutes and give you guys a very brief glimpse into our program in Douglas County and what we see that this proposed legislation, what effect it might have on us. We do provide stormwater services along with water and sewer services to about 140,000 residents of the city of Douglasville and Douglas County. Our program is probably pretty typical of those that that Scott and Doug talked about, we are the MS4 permit holder for both jurisdictions, so we are bound to provide all of the services, fulfill all the requirements of the Phase 2 small MS4 permit within those communities. Our program also focuses a lot on replacing, repairing the failing infrastructure that seems to be under so many of our roads. We provide consulting services to our residents that have private property stormwater issues. We also perform flood studies and update the FEMA maps throughout our jurisdiction so that our property owners know what their flooding risk is. We also have a voluntary program to purchase and demolish houses that are within the floodplain within Douglas County. This is with the cooperation of those property owners. We're not going to go take somebody's house that doesn't want to give it to us, but for those that want to cooperate, we do purchase, demolish those structures. Our goal being to get every house we can out of the floodplain so that we don't see our residents have the tragic effects that we saw 8 years ago in the terrible 2009 flooding that impacted us so badly. And there are several other aspects of our program I won't go into, but all that to say, it's about a $4.5 million a year program. It is funded solely through our stormwater utility. We're a public body corporation sanctioned by the Georgia legislature, and I'm not exactly sure what that means, although I can say it means we're not part of the city or the county government and we have no taxing authority. So our only funding mechanism for the stormwater services is this utility. We've looked at our system. We believe that if the proposed legislation were to pass, it could reduce our revenues by up to 60%, and that would have quite an impact on our ability to provide those services. Quite frankly, what it would mean is the burden for providing those services would shift off of the properties that would qualify for the exemption, and it would shift onto our residents, quite frankly. And that's not something that we want to do. I do also want to mention we offer credits as part of our utility. We offer up to 80% credits. If a property owner meets certain criteria, we believe that the control of those credits should remain local. They are based on property owners installing and maintaining certain controls on their site, as well as certain activities to reduce pollutants that get discharged into the stormwater system. And we use some of the funding to inspect and enforce maintenance on these controls that for which they're getting credits. That's one of the reasons that we believe the local control is so important. That concludes my statements.
Thank you very much for your presentation. James Moore, and after James, I think it's Rick Ettinger, correct? Thank you.
Good morning. My name is James Moore, and I am the stormwater specialist with the Georgia Association of Water Professionals. GAWP is a 501c3 education organization formed to provide training for frontline professionals in the water industry in the state of Georgia. We were established 85 years ago and serve more than 10,000 people to take care of our water systems throughout the entire state. Prior to being an employee of GAWP, I was a member, serving in the city of Griffin as the Deputy Stormwater Director, primarily providing direct service to the ratepayers of our community. I know firsthand how the stormwater utility benefited Griffin and enabled me and our team to do our jobs. We work directly with our residents, addressing flooding concerns, we cleared and fixed drains, replacing pressure broken pipes, cleaning drainage ditches, maintaining detention ponds, and work with the developers on site plans. Through these efforts and others, we provided and improved public safety, health, and quality of life in the community. These services and my job were funded exclusively through the stormwater utility. GAWP is committed to working to ensure that all member utilities have the means to make similar positive impacts in their communities. We recognize that access to clean, abundant water is absolutely critical to the economic development and quality of life of the state of Georgia. Without effective stormwater management, it is more difficult and expensive to provide that water. Without a dedicated funding source, meaningful stormwater management becomes much more difficult. For this reason, GAWP agrees with the 2008 Georgia Comprehensive Statewide Water Management Plan that, quote, local stormwater utilities should be encouraged as a mechanism for funding the administration, operation and maintenance, and capital costs of stormwater and non-point source pollution controls, unquote. The fact is, we're all users of stormwater services. But each community has their own particular needs and it places different values on the services. It is GAWP's position that local governments need flexibility in establishing both their level of service and determining the funding mechanism appropriate for their own individual community. Levels of service, credit, exemptions, and other utility policies are best determined by local governments and the constituents that they serve. Stormwater utilities in Georgia have a 2-decade track record of making substantive change to communities they serve, protecting water quality, preventing flooding, and preserving public health. They seem to work. GAWP looks forward to assisting the study committee any way we can as you get underway. And I'll thank you for your time and attention. I wish you guys luck as you get underway. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moore. Rick, come on. And while you're coming up, I want to also welcome to our committee Diane Parks. Since glad you're here. We had a moment early in the beginning of the meeting. Introduce yourself.
I was on the back row, so
So you were really here. Okay. Now you're officially here. Thank you.
Ms. Parker is on the city council in Auburn, Georgia. She's one of the people that decide how long I get to keep this gift.
Well, we'll consult later. Sorry, go ahead. And it's Rich Ettinger?
It's Rich Ettinger. I don't know how I can
Rich,
follow that.
okay.
Well, thank you to the study committee for allowing me to come and make some public comment about stormwater management fees. I think the presentations that were done today were really excellent, and really this is what local control looks like. Let me introduce myself. I'm a vice president with Clark Patterson Lee. We're an architecture, engineering, and planning firm, and we work in the municipal government market, in part by designing roads, water systems, sewer systems, stormwater systems, in support of local government's needs. This is really what local control looks like. Stormwater utilities have evolved as a way for local governments to address the maintenance and regulatory compliance requirements that have been put on their MS4s. What we're really talking about here is how is local government going to fund these activities, because they're not going away. And so they have, many have chosen to create a fee which is very equitable. And we've heard testimony this morning on exactly how those were put together. And it's a much more refined instrument than general taxation to support such activities. So, SB 116 really kind of upends that process. It would largely defund a lot of these stormwater utilities, because almost every development in Metro Atlanta has a stormwater report on file describing how they have managed on-site stormwater. And so the utilities would really be gutted, and the requirements would be thrown onto the backs of residents who are not going to be able to go to the local government and pull out a stormwater management report and show how their property meets or is stormwater neutral. We don't exempt businesses and property owners from paying their water bill because they have a plumbing system inside their building. And similarly, we shouldn't exempt properties from paying a stormwater utility fee just because they have an on-site stormwater system. That on-site stormwater system does not eliminate the impact from that development. And so, as local governments strive to figure out how to fund the maintenance activities and the regulatory compliance activities that they have to do, the stormwater utility is a really essential tool for that. So, thanks very much for your time.
Susan Rutherford.
Thank you for the opportunity to provide comment. My name is Susan Rutherford. I'm with the City of Atlanta, Department of Watershed Management. We do not have a stormwater utility fee, but I thought it would be useful to just express to you some of the needs that we have for stormwater in Atlanta. First of all, I'd also like to commend the speakers and just to say that these organizations like the Southeast Stormwater Association, I was on the board of that organization for 6 years, along with Steve Leo, and this organization is not homogeneous in its in its opinions about federal regulations and environmental regulations and how the best way to expend public funds. So the kind of surveys and the kind of research and the kind of advocacy that comes out of this group is based on quite a bit of a wide range of opinions and political opinions related to how to respond to environmental issues that face all of this. With that said, the Atlanta Department of Watershed Management is a water and wastewater utility. Again, we do not have a stormwater utility fee. We operate off of an enterprise fund, and so when you pay your drinking water and sewer bill in the city of Atlanta, you're not paying for stormwater services. You're only paying for the provision of drinking water services and wastewater services. The Department of Public Works and the general fund is where they take care of the streets, and that's where most of the stormwater system is located. But the streets, the Public Works Department really is just in the business of keeping the roads clear for transportation purposes and repaving, and they are barely able to do that with the funding that they receive from the general fund. In the Department of Watershed Management, we run most of the MS4 permit activities because those are tied to our NPDES permits that allow us to discharge our treated wastewater effluent into the Chattahoochee River. And we do everything that we can to manage stormwater under the pretty strict guidelines that restrict us into water sewer enterprise funds, because we don't want to run afoul of the law or our ratepayers that are paying for those water sewer services to use them for stormwater. So, but we are doing the compliance and the permitting under our water sewer funds. We have some of the strictest regulations in the state with regards to floodplains and post-development and stream buffer regulations. And another thing that we are also trying to do another way we also maximize our stormwater management capabilities is by using our wastewater funding to relieve capacity in the combined sewer system. And so you see the big stormwater pond at historic Fourth Ward Park on the Beltline, which is a 9 million gallon pond that can capture up to a 500-year rain event. And that is actually a wastewater project because it keeps stormwater out of the combined sewer system. So even with all of this that we're trying to do under the water and wastewater fees, we still have, by a study that we did a few years ago, we still have about an annual need of about $40 to $60 million a year for stormwater, and that is maintenance and the CIP all together. Our stormwater system is managed on an emergency-only basis. You have the guys going out before a rainstorm and unclogging with the vac trucks to unclog basins. We are not able to have a comprehensive maintenance and management program under the funding that we have. Our city council is well aware of this problem, and they have asked our department to try and come up with a way to address stormwater. And so we are looking at a stormwater utility fee. One intermediate step that we have taken is to allow the use of our MOST funds, our municipal option sales tax funds, to fund stormwater. And so, but as you know, the MOST is it's a temporary funding source. It's got to be reauthorized every 4 years. And so that's not a basis on which to develop a comprehensive and a comprehensive kind of a program. Also, The $12 million a year that we're going to get from that for the next 4 years is really paying for Band-Aid fixes to some real, just big, just some real crumbling areas that where there's lots of localized flooding and a lot of complaints. So this is not, again, this is not allowing us to develop a fully comprehensive stormwater management program. So that's just, I just wanted to express some of the needs that we have in the city of Atlanta and the different ways that we're trying to get at that. And a stormwater utility fee, even while it wouldn't address that entire $40 to $60 million a year amount, would definitely help us to address the problems that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rutherford. To our committee, to our presenters, and to our staff, we'll have lunch provided for you. To our audience and guests who are here today, we will reconvene here at 1:10, begin our afternoon program at 1:15. So thank you very much. Any concluding comments from our chairman?
I'm good, Madam Chair. I'm not sure if I'm gonna keep my motors or not.
I'll go campaign door to door. So I thank you. To do is have a collection place for those ideas. So Nicole Chappelle, who's administering this committee, will send out an email, and our staff will sit down and work and collect the ideas so we can have it specifically written down. And then also we will send out some suggested dates, but I think the Senator and I agreed that our next meeting will be in Atlanta. And so you will be getting an email from Nicole next week, and just consider any suggestions. I mean, afterwards, you're gonna think of some ideas too. So just, we'll send out the email and then respond to that with suggestions, and we'll do suggested dates as well. Any questions? So our next presenter is Dr. Frank Keller. Thank you, sir.
You didn't tell him he looked like a grandfather, but he was the grandfather of stormwater fees in Georgia.
Thanks a lot.
And you're still here.
Yeah, I'm still here. I'm not sure how long, but I'm here. I want to thank y'all for letting me address, and I'm not going to take these slides. You've got them in your folder because you heard it was redundant, some of this stuff from this morning. So I'm going to make some observations. And Mr. Norton had asked for some information, and you know, with technology the way it is, I found it for him. You asked about the constitutionality. Constitutionality and statutory authority is Article 9, Section 2, Paragraph 3 of the 1983 Constitution of Georgia. It grants the power to counties and municipal corporations to control, collect, and move forward with stormwater and sewage and collection and disposals. When you go to OCGA Section 36-82-61, it's the bond law, and it includes stormwater in the bond law that you can actually bond for stormwater. And then OCGA Section 3635-3 is the home rule, and it gives them the opportunity to create ordinances and adopt regulations. So it is founded, because that's part of my presentation that I'm going to make to y'all of the due diligence that we had to go through. Something I want to remind y'all too before I get started with my presentation is I don't think some people realize that years ago, a long time ago, probably before us, water and sewer rates were paid out of taxes. About 50% of municipalities had their water and sewer rates in their taxes, okay? So they had to come up with a development or a measurable goal in order to bill for water and sewer. So the tie-in there is that stormwater isn't any different than water and sewer was in the past, okay? We just made it, moved it forward, was able to meter it, calculate it, and move on. So that's another observation I made this morning. Another observation I want to make, and this is just a little, and I really thank you, Senator, again for calling me an old man, because I am. And I'm going to tell you why, because in this room, and we talk about local control, local issues. I addressed the Cobb County Board of Commissioners back about 10 years ago with Huck up there, and on a stormwater utility. They've yet to act on it because it's a local issue, and they don't feel like it's politically correct at this time to have a stormwater utility in Cobb County. I addressed the city of Atlanta, sweated to death under their public lights because they didn't tell me they filmed it. All right? Had no idea, addressed them, and they opted to have one, and then it went away because of some actions. Another local rule. Another one, Fayette County passed a stormwater utility. I addressed their commissioners. You know what's happening next month? They're repealing it because they passed SPLOST. So it's a local issue. It has nothing to do with the state coming in and painting a picture for us. It's all local. Some people, Gainesville. I talked to Gainesville twice, and they made a conscious decision not to have a stormwater utility. So it's all about where you live and who you are and what your special needs are. Other people in this room talked to Roswell's here. They've got a utility. Douglas County, talked to them 3 times, went on TV once to them. And then we had a joint hug with Gwinnett County years ago when we were deciding up there whether there's going to be 17 utilities or 1 utility. But when the young gentleman called me and asked me if I'd present, I was more than happy to. I was finally got over moping because I wasn't on the committee. So, when I finally got over it, you know, I said, you know, well, thanks for at least asking me. So I guess the point that I'm making is they said they wanted me to tell you why, how, and what. City of Griffin is one of these small southern country towns that's very proud of military, and they operate in a methodology that moves forward. They take destiny in their own control. We created our first stormwater utility in the state. We created the next Metro feeder airport that's going to be built in 2 more years, and we built a reservoir that supplies people regionally. We don't wait for opportunities. We take them because we have to address what's moving in the future. We went to, why did we go? You saw the pictures. There's people flooding. You got aging infrastructure, no funds. I found out yesterday my condition assessment came in. I've got $42 million of pipes that need to be repaired after we had an engineering firm come in. And we're going to divide that by 2 because everybody knows engineering firms come in high because they use concrete pipe versus some other activities. But the point that I'm making is that, yeah, Griffin came out and we did this, and, you know, the consequences were that we had to make sure it was fundamentally right and how we did it, but in law and in nature. We went to Georgia EPD and we went to GFA at the time, and they kicked us out the door. They didn't want to acknowledge stormwater utilities. It was new in the 90s, didn't want to touch it. So what is a local government to do but look for an alternative funding source? And that's how the stormwater utility started in Georgia. When EPD wouldn't recognize this, as GFA said, it took us 3 years to get the EPD to finally address the issue, because you know EPD is joined at the hip with GFA when you want state revolving loan funds. So if you can't get a state revolving loan fund, then you got an issue. So we worked through these challenges and had that opportunity. We wrote the first stormwater design manual in the state of Georgia because we were working on the Blue Book and we just couldn't get enough money in the Metro District when they used to be on Northside Drive to get the Blue Book built. So we wrote our own Blue Book, okay? So, I mean, those are some of the challenges on the front end that we figured we had to get right. And it was a long road. How? That's why. How? You got legal research. Drew Whalen III wrote a paper, and you can Google it. It's on the website. You can pull it up. It'll cover all that information that you want to know about the constitutionality and legal aspects of a utility. And we spent about 2 years. Second thing in the how is political buy-in. Now, I used to be a commission salesman, so I'm a pretty good BS artist, okay? I know how to sell something, because at the end of the month, I have to feed my kids, okay? So what I do is we sit in there, and I sat down with the elected officials, and I said, you know, y'all hired me in '92, and now you tell me you ain't got no money. And so, you know, I said, something doesn't work good here. So they said, we'll find a way. And so we did. We went out, spent 2 or 3 years, went to North Carolina, went to Florida, yada, yada, yada. And then we got everybody involved at the council level and said, look, this may not be the most popular thing. You might get it voted out next time. Because the reality is somebody had to make the hard decisions. And so they made the hard decisions. We went out and saw subject matter experts because at that time, and I'm not saying I'm a subject matter expert now, but I just said I didn't know a whole lot about nothing in stormwater, just what I read. So we went out and hired some engineers, Hector Sear, Andy Reese, some of the best in the nation. We vented them and we started the utility. When in the process of starting the utility, now some of y'all don't live in rural communities, but there used to be in the old days a thing called a poke directory, and had a list of everybody's name in the directory. Well, in the old days, when somebody came to you in the newspaper, they used to have to sign their name. So what we did was when we opened up the poke directory, I called them up and said, "Can I come talk to you? Whether you like it or not, the utility let me talk to you." Another thing we did, because this is what my dissertation involved around is we got the water wastewater customers, so now I'm over it now, it wasn't then, we got the top 100 customers. I visited every president, I visited every general manager, every superintendent, and the top 150 and sat down, talked to them and said, this is what we're doing. I know it's not a popular thing, but at the end of the day, the infrastructure's worn out, we got flooded roads, we gotta move on. So that's kind of like the how where we got started. When we voted the ordinance, and then we created the rate ordinance, we had the stormwater utility ordinance, we had 0 people. They got so tired of seeing me at Kiwanis clubs, Rotary clubs, what have you. But the whole idea is being informed, making an intelligent decision, okay? And I think, that, we got a long ways to go on some issues in stormwater. And I've written a primer for the preface for what best management practices looks like in a stormwater utility. So and I've shared that with a couple people. So what did we learn? Because I want my other folks to speak. Y'all heard me enough already. What did we learn? We had 7 319 grants because of the stormwater utility. We've done more research than probably anybody in the state, in the southeast, on BMPs. We got a T21 grant, because I'm going to drive all this home in a minute. It was a research grant. We did proprietary protocol verification for the US EPA ETV/NSF program on proprietary BMPs in the year 2000. Got everybody to the table, 32 backed out, 6 stayed in. We sampled them, and the whole issue is by looking at protocol verification, I'm getting back to also detention ponds. Stormwater has bypass. I don't care what anybody says, don't want to pick on the senator again or anything, but you got bypass. And when you got bypass, you've got reconstituted solids, you've got all sorts of stuff that's flowing down the creek that somebody's got to take care of at the end of the day. And when you got TMDLs like we do on Cabin Creek and with Potato Creek, we got to deal with it. We've got to try to effectively put these BMPs in place that work to a certain level, and then we got to figure out what's going on. Well, how did we figure out what's going on? And I kind of was excited about telling you all about this because one thing I learned a long time ago being in private industry, I've had 8 different careers. One of them was that I ran a factory in Peachtree City, had 600 employees. So I know what it is at the end of the day, what it takes to move a product from point A to point B, and what it makes to be for good economic development. We have partnered with one company in our town that built $1 million hospice and has a $500,000 BMP on it. And I said, you know what? We need regional detention in this area. You need a lake. You want to go overlook at it more. And it's a beautiful $1 million hospice sitting over this lake. We put a Bandalog in there, a floatables collector, and it's a beautiful project. And we funded the GFA loan for 20 years. He's paying us back every month for a 20-year period of time. Just like when you talked to me before, Senator, again, we funded the money for a regional detention pond for our Walmart and had some stuff and change. So I really have a hard time understanding why we all think that stormwater utilities are really creating an issue as far as the economy's going. We keep bringing industries in. We've just now loaded up our industrial park with 5 industries. It's not hurting anybody, and I really think that we need to rethink and sit down, and I'm really glad you have this committee served because I'd like to work with you all some more on this to really try to make this thing work out. Because we do need money for infrastructure, folks. Our budgets are just, if y'all have, I got ad valorem side budget, I got water and wastewater budget, I've got a golf course budget that's enterprise, and I got stormwater. And my ad valorem tax budget is hurting big time, and the only way that I can fix stormwater infrastructure is to have a stormwater utility and use it appropriately. And I want to say thank y'all for letting me be here today. And I'll take questions, and then I got to scoot because I got the Federal Highway Administration auditing me next week.
And I want to take an opportunity to thank Dr. Keller. He was one of the first people that I talked with about stormwater fees, and because he was kind of one of the first folks in it. And what was kind of interesting was when we brought it up, I said, well, what was the last big project that you had come to Griffin? He said, oh, that's the Super Walmart. I said, well, what did it hit the tax digest at? He said $25 million. I said, okay. Now you had a 100-acre field and nothing on it, no impervious surface. They weren't paying a stormwater fee. You put a Super Walmart on it, 100 acres, and they come in, we know they've invested $25 million. Said, as it turns out, Walmart sells stuff. They generate sales tax. They're the largest employer in Georgia. So they employ people. Said they're kind of like an economic engine in themselves. So for me, I said, which would your community rather have, 100 acres of nothing or 100 acres of Walmart? Said and he says, well, obviously the Walmart's a big plus. I said, great. So we can both agree that we want to see economic development in Georgia. We have differences of opinion, said on how it goes. It wasn't until our committee, where we had testimony in committee, that I come to find out that the stormwater management for Walmart is done by the city. And my legislation that I introduced they would still be paying a stormwater management fee because it's not on their property and they're not mitigating the stormwater on their own property. So for me, it's kind of interesting, we had to get to committee before we got to that understanding, but when I look, Dr. Keller, I thank you for being a pioneer in this. I'm not against stormwater fees. I think that there's a place. What we're here to discuss is how do we create them? How do we implement them? The repercussions on them, uniformity, the way that those fees go. And that's what our committee is tasked with. And we had some great dialogue at lunch, and I want to continue that in our next committee meeting and kind of where we go. And I thank you for taking time out of your day to come and talk to us like you did all those other local governments.
Hey man, it's all about working together because this is a great state. And we need to move forward, but we need to move forward in a positive direction in Georgia. Thank you all.
Thank you. We might have some questions for our committee.
Go ahead.
Questions, committee members? You covered it all.
Yeah.
Thank you much.
Usually people want to see me leave, so I'm not.
I got that feeling.
So, from ACCG, we have Kathleen Bowen.
Hello, I'm Kathleen Bowen, and I am here on behalf of ACCG, and we do represent all 159 counties in the state. I've been asked to cover two things. One, an overview of the county-run stormwater utility programs, and then two, what's ACCG's position on stormwater utilities. So currently there are 11 Georgia counties that have stormwater utilities. You'll see them here on the map. Macon-Bibb is highlighted because they are the most recent county to consider implementing a stormwater utility. So that would take the numbers to 12. The first county was Columbia County, and that was in 2000. Athens-Clarke County, these quotes are from an op-ed piece from February 2017 in the Athens Banner-Herald. They've stated that before their stormwater utility was created, which it was created in 2005, that the county funded their stormwater management program using the general fund. So that's property taxes. When the plan passed to create a stormwater utility, the county was able to reduce their millage rate by 0.6 mils to reflect those costs shifting from the general fund to a newly created utility. They also said that a typical medium-sized residential homeowner property tax bill would increase by 3 times if their stormwater utility was done away with. Macon County, as I said, is the most recent government to implement a stormwater utility program. They're in the discussions now, but they have been funding it with SPLOST funds, and they have indicated that the sales tax dollars were not keeping up with the demands they had for their stormwater runoff. These quotes are from a June 2017 article in the Macon Telegraph. As it's already been stated, when you have a stormwater utility in your community, everybody pays. This is everybody: residential, commercial, state, nonprofits, entities, schools, universities, religious organizations. If you're only relying on the property tax, that's just your residential and commercial properties paying. Stormwater credits have already been covered a lot, so I won't go into that, but I will state for the record that every county that runs a stormwater utility offers credits. And one thing I don't think has been mentioned yet, that a lot of counties give credits to the school systems for having an educational program. I know Augusta, Richmond County offers 35% credit to the schools for doing that. Columbia County has 20% credit for their rain barrels. If you have a rain barrel on your property, you get a 20% credit. The Douglasville utility gives commercial property owners a credit if they attend a water conservation class. So there are some unique credits that are out there amongst our counties. And the last thing I'm supposed to cover is our position. We have had a position in our policy platform for 13 years now, so this is not a new issue for us. It is something that we've been working with the General Assembly on for over 13 years now. Stormwater management is a real infrastructure need, and we do believe that the stormwater utility program is the most equitable way to pay for that infrastructure. We have taken a defensive or opposing position to legislation that has threatened effectively managing stormwater utilities, but we do appreciate the opportunity from Senator Ginn and Chairman Smith. We have been at the table and we are having the dialogue. So while we have been defensive in nature, very strongly defensive, we are still appreciative of the opportunity to come to the table and discuss these issues with y'all. So thank you for that opportunity. And you have 2 county experts on the panel here with Steve Leo and Mike Thomas, so they can answer all the questions for you.
Any questions from the committee? Yes.
Thank you very much for providing me some utilities information and study on the computed bills, which I will use as homework.
Okay.
I would suggest that you supply the rest of the committee the same.
Okay.
But you may be, it may be in here, but I didn't, taking a quick look at it, didn't see this. Have you done a study on the exemptions that are in the counties that you do? So you said that everybody pays, yet surely somewhere in these 39 counties or so, you have exemptions for religious organizations or parks or government or roads or...
No.
No exemption.
That's not counties.
Roads,
from the county.
roads would be exempted in most cases.
Roads, right,
But they're publicly owned, and that's part of what the fund pays for, is managing the pipes that are under those, and they are part of the drainage system of the city.
we can get you that data. The report I gave him is from the UNC Department of, I think it's Environmental Studies. They did a report they just released in March that shows you every stormwater utility in the state and what their rates are and what they're generating on a yearly basis. So it's a really good report. I'll make sure to share it with you. I do have data, and GMA is following me. We both did data for Senator Ginn last summer that shows what all the utilities are doing and what the credit programs are that they're offering. So we did that data.
Is a credit different than an exemption? But a credit is not exemption.
Legally, yes, it's different.
It's different.
Legally.
So an exemption would be I exempt the park or I exempt churches.
We'll look into that for you.
Based on its class.
Based on its class, yes.
Yeah, not based on its.
That's really what I'm trying to understand is.
It's based on a class versus individual site characteristics, which is what a credit would be based on.
I think there's a chart that was done, CDM Smith, and it said this was their survey or FSA, SES, I don't know how to learn these acronyms. Public roads, according to their survey, public roads exemptions were 61% across the country, railroads 50%. I'd love to see this kind of information for the counties that we currently
Well, we
have.
have to survey 11, I can get that for you.
You don't have, and you just do counties, you don't do
Just do
cities.
county, correct. GMA's following, you can post them.
Cities got it. Ditto for your cities guy, whoever it is, ditto for this.
No, we can get you that data.
All right, so we'll make it available for the
Yes.
committee as a whole. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Norton and Ms. Wright. I do want to say while we're waiting for our next presenter, which is Michael Ferguson and Ron Feldner, we are here at the University of Georgia, and the University of Georgia is a land grant institution. And with that land grant comes responsibilities, one of which is the extension office that is throughout the state of Georgia. And these are resources available to every county in Georgia. They even do urban areas. And so, let me take a moment here. They teach industries how to do certain ponds, and they can do the gamut of education, which is a component maybe we need to see if, what happens when you have these kind of meetings and hearings is that the individual property owner starts asking, what can I do? And so it helps individuals, and it also helps our business and industry. So I just want to give a nod, and just so happens I'm a graduate of the University of Georgia, but it had no bearing on that. Mike?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, committee members, for the opportunity to speak today. I'm Michael McPherson. I'm with the Georgia Municipal Association. My policy areas are both environment, natural resources, and community development. And there's plenty of overlap there. For the past 4 years, my policy area was revenue and finance. And that's where a lot of this discussion is going. It's how do we pay for infrastructure the right way? And this is not a topic that hasn't already been studied in depth. Okay, I think that point needs to be made first off. But before I start to talk about the history of studying and that, I want to point out that on the federal level, we are under threat of losing different aspects, different programs that pay for this type of infrastructure, whether or not you have a stormwater utility in place. So one of the things that might increase cost significantly across the board, no matter what infrastructure we're talking about, is the federal bond exemption program that's under fire at the federal level. If that should go away, the cost of infrastructure will increase dramatically, or at least to the point where those bonds are exempted. CDBG and USDA grants, the ag grants, those are also being looked at for cuts. And so in this environment of the federal government looking at opportunity to recapture revenues at the local and state level, we've got to be weary of instituting an exempted class in stormwater utility fees. And I think if we look at statewide water plan, we'll see that it is one of the prime reasons that we have multiple stormwater utilities in place.
Give the background briefly on this stormwater management plan.
So this is an
Creation.
overall plan that the state passed, and it's a guideline for the regional planning districts to come up with solutions that fit their specific needs geographically.
There was a study committee established in 2001, I believe, at the same time that there was legislation passed with the city of Atlanta. And so, with the exception of the metro area, the rest of the state studied this issue for about 7 years before it came to a consensus through this resolution that created this plan. Do I have that right? Okay, so just a caution while we're talking here, anytime we get into debate on water policy or anything to do with this resource, we need to be aware that there are unintended consequences. And so one of the things we try and do, even if it might take a while, is that we've got to filter through and find out how do we establish a balance. And I lived through that. I'm happy to be a survivor almost of that whole debate, because it was very contentious at times. It's very emotional. So as we debate right here, I just want to always caution to make sure we're taking the right steps. Sometimes small steps get you to that big step eventually, so just keep that in mind as well.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thanks for bringing that up. I've been looking for copies of these, so thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. So if you would, you can turn to page 31 under Enhanced Pollution Management Practices. And it kind of covers some ideas for improvement at the regional level. But then turn over to page 32 and implementation actions, under implementation actions on the first column, B. One of those actions is encouraging local stormwater utilities as a mechanism for funding the administration, operations, maintenance, and capital costs of stormwater and non-point source pollution controls. Now I want to point to C, under 2, in the second column. State and local government requirements related to low-income impact development, improved site design, and growth management consistent with watershed protection and maintenance of water quality standards. So it's not one tool in the toolbox. It is a mechanism that requires design and standards on the construction side. And as local governments, it's not just water that we're looking at. We're looking at public safety requirements and the whole 9 yards to ensure that whatever's being built will hold up and not fall down under the weight of the construction itself. Fire codes being met. So there's lots of other aspects that go into whatever fees may be charged when you're talking about construction. So that's something I can't emphasize enough. But in terms of water quality, all of these things were considered as a whole when they came up with this plan. And we're glad that they did. Now, if we step back and we look at the general fund, and we look at our tax base, the general fund, the reason why certain communities don't feel that it's appropriate to fund their stormwater needs through the general fund is because of all of the exemptions that Catherine pointed out very clearly. That bucket has a hole in it, a big one. And part of the conversation that we heard before, certain entities measure on-site and off-site burden. And I think that's a good thing. It's not just on-site. Anybody that has a presence in a jurisdiction has off-site burden that they need to pay into. The marketplace consists of the whole, and so in determining where you want to purchase property, whether it's for business or residential or commercial use or retail use, you would consider those things. And if the infrastructure wasn't there to provide for a decent quality of business life, decent quality of life, you wouldn't choose to buy there. And so in Griffin, I seriously doubt that Walmart would have chosen Griffin had they not proved that they had a quality of life to support that business. And they just so happen to have a stormwater utility in place. Sales tax was mentioned as a tool to pay for anything infrastructure-wise. Special option sales tax is something that specific areas of the state over the past few years have seen go up as the economy has risen. But at the same time, there's a lot of areas of the state that have not come back from the economic decline that we saw. And their sales tax base was hit hard, not only from the turn of the economy, but from sales tax exemptions as a whole that have proven to be economic development tools. So no matter what source we're talking about, they've got giant holes in them. And if we use sales tax to fund something that has year in, year out need, you've got to be wary that the economy dictates sales tax collections. And so 1 year or a stretch of years may be great, but in the future, those funds may not be there. And so there may be another look to form a stormwater utility in a place that once considered it, that said, hey, we got enough sales tax paid for it right now. So with that, every community has the ability right now to plan better, as we've seen in the testimony. You can plan further out. You've got a fee that pays for these stormwater utilities, and you balance the community's needs by your credit structure and your rate structure. And so I feel that we may have opportunity to look into some of the specifics as far as how we do things, but to interject at the state level a exempted class would be to do to a stormwater utility program what has been done to the general fund and what has been done to the sales tax base. It would be to create a whole limit. And so we're happy to be part of the process and part of the discussion, conversation, and look forward to working with you all the way. We feel that there's probably a better way to do it than to form an exempted class. But if we need to look at the credit structure, let's do it. Let's find a solution that we can all be proud of. But we certainly stand opposed with ACCG to an exempt class.
I'm good for 100% credits, if that's what you're getting at.
Well, I mean,
That's
I don't
what I thought.
know that. Yeah, I don't know that. I think any offsite consideration would completely ruin 100% credit. But everyone has to at least accept some of the burden for the system that they enjoy, the infrastructure that they enjoy. But there are credits that are substantial throughout these stormwater utilities, and people take advantage of it.
Any questions from the committee? So will you be introducing Mr. Fed?
Well, Ron, I mean,
I've got one little thing on credits I do want to talk about, Good afternoon. I told everybody when I talked ahead of the meeting I have about 5 minutes, and I was about right. Ron Feldner, Garden City Manager, but my background is I'm a civil engineer, Georgia Tech from 1989, so I've been dealing with stormwater issues for the better part of about 25, 30 years now. And I want to talk about the Garden City situation as it relates to credits and the 100% credit issue, and I think I've got an interesting perspective here. Back in 2008, we formed our stormwater utility and dealt with this very issue of how do we apportion the cost of credits. And at the time, as every stormwater utility in its inception has their key or unique customers that find their way into City Hall and they want to talk about certain issues. This particular group of key customers brought an attorney with them. So that usually gets our attention. And we had prepared ourselves for the initial meeting, but then through the discussion, we were going to have a follow-up meeting. And as we talked through the issue, we came up with an analysis that we prepared for that group of key customers and their attorney to look at what we call parcel-specific impacts and citywide impacts, and broke this up into two buckets of cost. And really this is similar to what was said earlier in terms of on-site and off-site impacts. And what we determined was that our budget, as we had conceived it at the time, was split about 50% between services provided to the customer associated with their private parcel, and then 50% of the costs were associated with citywide activities. And those citywide activities have been discussed today, such as regulatory compliance, whether it's NPDES stormwater, National Flood Insurance Program, operations and maintenance, or capital projects. But we did offer a maximum 50% credit, and I'm going to tweak that for a second here, but let me say this first. We offered a 50% credit towards a parcel-specific impact associated with an individual customer account. So what we did by offsetting or reducing by that particular fee with the 50% maximum was we gave 100% credit for the impact of that individual parcel. But we did not credit out the citywide cost of the program, because once again, that had to be undertaken regardless of whether or not that particular parcel did extensive stormwater management controls on its site. So to the question earlier that's been posed, we do offer a full credit on the private parcel impact side, but we certainly don't credit out the citywide services that we documented to be inherent to our program operation on a day-to-day basis. So we did make a slight adjustment, because once again, there's always key customers, unique customers in every stormwater utility that gave the city the ability to increase up to 65% for unique situations where documentation was adequately provided. So we feel like we have been equitable in Garden City, and we have done the due diligence and the research in which to set forth our policy, as opposed to simply taking what another community had done and simply applying that to ours. And we've had confirmation that this approach has worked, and I'll tell you why. Over the years, and we've been in operation now about 8 years, we've had several large rainfall events within the city. And for the most part, we've managed those well. But our true test was a year ago tomorrow, Hurricane Matthew. 13.96 inches of rain in 24 hours. It was a 500-year storm. On October 7th, 2016, everybody was connected to the system. Everybody. Everybody was connected to the system. But we had invested millions of dollars in maintenance of our system over those previous 8 years. And as a result, we had minor and a little bit of moderate flooding. Now, I don't want to say anything about our neighbors, but if you read the paper in terms of Hurricane Matthew and our neighboring communities, there was significant flooding, boat rescues in our adjacent jurisdictions. We didn't have that, and we believe that in part, the reason why was millions of dollars was invested in maintenance of our stormwater program and capital projects since 2009. And once again, everybody paying their fair share, and the equity was there. And because of that, Garden City has fared well in those large storm events, and specifically last year. And once again, these storm events are out there. We know in 2009 it happened in Douglas County, where they had the equivalent of a 500 or 1,000-year storm. So these storms can and do occur. And when they do occur, you want to make sure that over time you have prepared yourself for those kind of events. And we believe that our policy and our program all came together over the years to enable us to withstand such an event. I will say that there are a few stormwater utilities out there in the state that do not have a credit program. And I absolutely positively disagree with the policy that those communities have set up. And that we need to set a management practice, a best practice, whatever it may be, to make sure that everyone offers credits where credit should be due. But once again, those credits have to be set up through the local jurisdiction regarding the local conditions, whether it's coastal Georgia, southwest Georgia, or north Georgia. And from there, I think that the stormwater utilities continue to operate. And as I said back at our meeting in June, GMA, maintain this balance between economic development and good infrastructure management. And those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? Yes.
I do have a question.
Yes, state your name.
And I apologize, I'm from North Georgia, so I didn't know where Garden City was till she told me. As I understand it, the Frank Norton.
Yeah.
So the Ports Authority, Georgia Ports Authority is in Garden City's jurisdiction?
A portion of it,
A
yes.
portion of it?
Yes.
And do they pay the same kind of stormwater fee / tax as everyone else?
They don't pay a stormwater tax, but they pay a very large stormwater fee, yes.
Okay. And what percentage of your stormwater tax fee revenue, what percentage of your revenue is the Georgia Ports Authority?
Well, I think they're our second largest account. Our largest account is Norfolk Southern.
Okay.
If I had to think off the top of my head, I think they pay about $1,200 a month. Norfolk Southern pays thousands of dollars a month for their rail yard. So, once again, talking about everyone pays the fee, or other than the road exemption, you've got Georgia Ports Authority, Norfolk Southern, all of those large areas that generate tremendous amounts of runoff, all pay a fee that is commensurate with our rate structure.
Great, thank you very much.
If I might ask you, on the Ports Authority, I'm a little bit familiar with their property because I used to chair the Economic Development Committee in the Senate, toured their things, and I know they have properties in other places. But most of their property is pretty darn close to that Savannah River. when I think about water running downhill, and their property, it rains on it, and it runs right, splashes over in the river, said what did you do to provide a service to the Georgia Ports Authority to earn that, you said $1,200 a month?
Yeah, the portion that's in Garden City jurisdiction is on the west side of the port property. Most of the property is in the unincorporated county along the river, but the western several acres is along Highway 25 and drains into the Pipe Makers Canal, which is not the Savannah River, and the local water body that is under the control of the various local governments. We also provide upstream stormwater management for runoff that comes down through Garden City and actually enters onto the port property. So they're part of a particular watershed that connects to a residential area of the city that we manage in a holistic manner to ensure that neither the port downstream nor the upstream properties from the port, from all their development, have any flooding issues.
Do you get charged for that property that's right beside the river?
No, we do not.
Thank you.
That is in the unincorporated county.
Yeah, and when I, so most of the Chatham County doesn't, I don't believe.
They do not.
Yeah, so now, just so my committee members can relate to this, here in Athens, Clark County, one of my other constituents that brought it to my attention, the Kinder Morgan has a tank farm out on the Jefferson Highway, if you're familiar with Athens, said it's a large petroleum tanks. All of those petroleum tanks out there are on gravel area. They all have retention in case one of those tanks were to rupture. Said their berm dikes around there. Said and whenever it rains, for the most part on that property, they have to open a valve to let the rainwater leave their property. They run that any water that hits their property through a oil water separator. Said just so you can kind of get in relationship, the dollar amount, they pay about $8,000 a year for that one site, which they have to open a valve to let the stormwater leave their property. Said the stormwater, it goes through a water oil separator in case there was any kind of a issue with the sheen or whatever. But I just so the fees are quite different across the different jurisdictions. So I just wanted to point that out to our committee members and anybody in the audience.
That's true, they are very difficult.
Any questions from the committee? Any committee member wish to make a statement? Thank you very much for your presentation. Any committee member wish to make a statement before we consider adjourning?
To a field trip.
Yes, to our field trip. But very quickly, yes.
I did want to add when we're looking for a legal person to invite to speak next time, if we could potentially ask Drew Whalen, since he was involved with the original stormwater utility and the Columbia County case, if he's willing to come, it would be nice to hear from him.
And to answer your question here, what we'll do is talk with our support team, and Nicole, if you'll raise your hands again. Nicole is our administrator, so she will be sending out an email to the committee members. And for two purposes. One, for you to have put in writing your suggestions, just because some have casually made suggestions. And then the second reason is we will have a few dates that we think we can make work for our next meeting. We'll try and do a consensus then of those dates. Any other comments from anybody? I want to thank the staff. I want to thank Athens Clark and this beautiful center. We have a timeline right now to catch a bus to tour some of these centers. So, do you want to?
I want to thank all our presenters and also all the people that attended. That it is an interesting subject. It's one that we're trying to make sure there's dialogue. Me and Chairman Smith are part-time legislators. I may be a more shorter part than she is, but it is good to be your senator, and thank you for y'all's attendance today.
Thank you. We are adjourned for this part of the meeting. We are in recess to take the next part of the meeting.